Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the world famous Adventurers Club of Los Angeles. My name is Alex Shoemate. I'm the current president of the club, number 1210. We have a slight change of setup tonight. As you can see, for the first time ever, Rich Mayfield is
sitting in this chair.
He's sitting in a different chair tonight. I am sitting in the interview chair tonight. Rich Mayfield is going to be our interviewee. Rich Mayfield, number 1211.
Yes.
We all came within like a week of each other. We were kind of a little block of this kind of fresh new energy coming to the club. And he's going to be talking to us tonight about his experience hiking the Appalachian Trail. And we're excited to have you back, obviously.
Thank you for having me.
Slightly different capacity. Before we get into everything, I'd like to remind everybody that if you are enjoying our programs, please subscribe to our YouTube channel. It helps us immensely to have everybody subscribe and to be up to date on our notifications. We're having interviews every single week that Rich, as first vice president of the club, has been putting together and has been fantastic in hosting. So I'm going to give it my best shot tonight. It's my first time doing this, so forgive me if there's any hiccups in the presentation. But with that being said,
next week's a business meeting.
The week after is a business meeting.
Next week we got, oh yeah, next week's Halloween, right?
Next week is Halloween week.
Yeah.
So we're going to have another
We're going to have a special presentation for Halloween, actually, that we're working on.
Are we?
Yeah, I want to give it away.
Oh, well, that's a surprise to me, so I'm looking forward to that as well. Maybe
it's going to be interesting. It's going to be a little bit different format. We'll talk about it afterwards. It's going to be fun.
Sounds good.
Yeah.
All right, so I figure one thing we should start is you had began this kind of presentation on your journey back when we were still having meetings in person prior to the whole closure and the epidemic. And you had touched base on your journey actually beginning in Key West?
Yeah, so I actually started this trip as like this grand tour up the Eastern Seaboard, right? There's a trail called the Eastern Continental Trail. Mm-hmm. And it's an amalgamation of two major trails, and that's the Appalachian Trail, which a lot of people know, and the Florida Trail. So I did give another talk on this, and I just focused on the Florida part because that's kind of like its own thing, right?
Yeah.
So I started down in Key West, and I traveled along the Florida Trail. I went all the way up to Pensacola. And that's kind of how I started this trip. And we talked about that at the club, and it was a pretty good presentation.
So in terms of trails, because I know the Appalachian Trail is an established trail.
Right.
Was this route through Key West, was it as established, or were there periods where you were kind of hacking your way through the bush, as it were, like wading through the Everglades, trying to get to the Appalachian Trail?
If you look at the map of the Florida Trail, you see this nice red line that goes through Florida. Mm-hmm. And this is the trail. And there is a route, right? And it does have a good data book. I think there's a picture of a data book from the Appalachian Trail and the pictures here. So they have it established. The route is established. That being said, on the ground, it's less obvious.
Yeah.
Right? So there would be times where you're kind of hiking through the dense Florida bush, and you can see the trail because it's the only piece of dirt in front of you that isn't bush, right?
Yeah.
And then all of a sudden you get to this big open farmer's field. And you look across and you're like, all right, so where's the other side of this thing? And it could be a mile across this field and there's cows in it or whatever.
It could be private property. And
So they've figured that out, right? Like they have agreements with all the private property owners, but that's part of maintaining the trail is they've got to come up with those agreements. Yeah. And where they can't come up with those agreements, they basically put the trail on a road.
Okay.
And that sucks.
Yeah.
Like walking along the road is like the worst compared to a trail in the middle of nowhere. People are driving by you in Florida, so they're chucking beer cans or White Claws at you or whatever.
They're not honking in support.
They don't honk at support, right? Like you're just like some crazy dude on the side of the road in Florida, right?
Yeah.
So you want to be off road as much as possible on a trail. And the Florida Trail, I kind of got bent out of shape about it because it was very much not all trail.
Yeah.
Contrast that with the Appalachian Trail, where you're probably on a roadway for, I don't know, a couple miles for 2,100 miles.
Yeah.
So very low percentage of time on the road. And what that means is that the Appalachian Trail is just phenomenally developed as a trail.
Yeah.
Right? You're in the woods the whole time, which is super cool.
So when you set out, I believe you said you set out in the spring? Mm-hmm. And so how long did this Florida, because I know that the Appalachian Trail, when people set out, this is a trail that takes months to complete.
Yeah, good question. I'm kind of fuzzy on the actual timeline. The whole thing took me 11 months. Florida Trail probably took me like 3 months.
So
3 months. Yeah.
Longer than proportionally.
Yeah. So the Appalachian Trail was the meat of the trip. But I mean, the Florida Trail isn't a small piece of trail. You know, it's quite a long ways from Key West up to Pensacola.
Yeah. Okay. So catching us up then in terms of now you've made it through the Florida portion.
Right.
You've reached the stepping off point of the Appalachian Trail.
Yeah.
What does that look like?
Well, okay. So let's back up. So when I got to Pensacola, right? So the Eastern Continental Trail has a suggested route, right? And the Appalachian Trail is established. The Florida Trail has got is established, even though it's on roads, right? But between Pensacola and Dahlonega, Georgia, or Springer Mountain, Georgia, where the Appalachian Trail starts, it's pretty loose.
Yeah.
There was this guy that kind of pioneered the trail, and maybe like 2 or 3 people a year like try to make it through. But basically, you're like backroads Alabama. And at that point, when I was at Pensacola, I was over walking on roads. Like I had taken off on this trip to get into the woods and everything.
Yeah,
and I was tired walking on 2-lane highways, right? So I'm like, screw this, I need to get to the Appalachian Trail as fast as possible. So I got myself a bike.
Okay.
Right? And I basically biked as fast as I could. It was like a 500-mile bike ride across Alabama.
Did you get some good barbecue while you're down there?
Yeah, I'm sure I did. You know, like you stop at every local restaurant you can because, you know, you want to carry as little food as possible, right? So
yeah.
and consume as many calories as possible. So like if there's a barbecue joint, I stopped at it.
But it's because I imagine that once you hit the start of the Appalachian Trail, all the communities and the towns that are along that trail are very familiar with hikers.
Oh yeah, they're wired for it.
Is it a similar environment in those southern regions that are not official? Like how many people, I guess, that are hiking the Appalachian Trail are trying to extend and do the full Atlantic Coastal
Eastern Continental Trail. ECT, yeah.
Are they predisposed to understand that there are hikers coming through there? Is there a hiker culture, or is it kind of you're on your own out there?
Not at all. Outside the Appalachian, I can't speak for the Pacific Crest Trail. The Pacific Crest Trail is probably pretty established, but like the Florida Trail, most people didn't know it was there.
Yeah.
A few people did. But you're right, the Appalachian Trail is geared towards hikers, and the communities know you're there, right? Everywhere else, like, might as well have been a homeless person. You know, it's like, who's this guy on a bike who's like got this scruffy beard, you know, and smells, you know, just wanders into town. I mean, you know, I'm not a homeless person, right? Because I come and I go and I don't hang out,
and
right?
You have a tent.
Yeah, I mean, homeless people have tents, right? But I also had a credit card,
Yeah.
and I was like, give me 3 meals at Outback, you know?
Yeah, yeah.
So, I mean, I know I definitely wrecked some, like, nice restaurants because, you know, I didn't care. I was like, hey, you know, like, get off this bike.
Yeah.
I want steak. Let's sit down. You know, I'm completely unshowered, you know, go in there. And
Yeah.
So they're not prepared for it. So once you get on the Appalachian Trail, it really is a sweet experience.
Yeah.
Because it's there. It's this corridor through the United States that's made for hikers, and you feel like at home. You don't feel weird about being a hiker.
And before we get into the Appalachian Trail, I'm curious, especially because you're taking this south-north route that's crossing over all kinds of biomes, climates, changes in wildlife. I mean, you're getting really the full scope of what the United States has to offer geographically, I imagine. Did you have any interesting wildlife encounters in that southern portion of the trip? Especially, and I guess not to cut too far ahead, but I imagine it's pretty bizarre to start your journey dealing with all the creepy crawlies that live in the Everglades.
Yeah.
And then getting to where you're up far north in the snow and worrying about bears and moose and wolves and stuff like that.
Yeah, so, you know, Florida is interesting. Obviously, there's like alligators everywhere.
Yeah.
Like everywhere. Like you just be walking, you're like, oh, an alligator. And they are kind of scary. Like I saw some alligators when I was camping that like went after each other, like they were fighting over something.
Yeah.
And you know, most of the time it's just this lizard that's laying there, right? You know, Carrot's big, but it's not bothering you. You just walk on by, right?
Yeah.
But I saw 2 of them go at it once, and it freaked me out because
Yeah.
they got very violent very quickly, and I was like, oh, that's tough. So lots of alligators. I got to see one like panther or like a black mountain lion once, like fleeting across the road, and I was like, oh my God.
I'm sure that's like
That's
rare.
so cool, yeah. The biggest danger is really hogs down there, wild hogs. And there was this one night where I heard something rustling And then like as I was walking at night and just had a headlamp on, so I couldn't really see anything. And then I hear like rapid scurrying, and I thought a hog was running at me. And in retrospect, it was probably like an armadillo or something, right? But I had it in my mind, in the middle of the night, that it was this hog that was going to come out and like gore me, right? So I like ran up a tree, and I'm like in this tree, like looking around, like, where's this hog,
Yeah.
And then I'm sitting up there, and like the adrenaline's coming down. I'm like, okay, it was probably just an armadillo. So I go to get out of the tree, and my backpack's on, right? And I'm in the tree, and I fall like backwards out of the tree, and like my foot is stuck in like a
knot or something.
Yeah, a branch, and I'm like fall basically on my head in the middle of nowhere.
Yeah.
So that was a little bit of scary encounter that wasn't even an encounter, right?
Yeah. Well, it could have been.
But it's in your head, right? And these hogs are crazy.
It could have been a pack of them. You have no idea.
Like a couple nights later, I came across these hikers, and they shot a hog, and they're like, we need help finding it. I'm like, oh yeah, I know where that is. So I like walked them over there, and they, we drugged this hog out of the woods. It was like a 300-pound hog. Drug it out of like the swamp, right? And they strung it up and butchered it and gave me like, it probably gave me like 30 pounds of meat. I'm like, I don't know what I'm going to do with this.
Did you try? Did you ever?
Yeah,
cook
so
any of it
I
up?
made a fire, tried to cook it, and it didn't go great, but it was an experience, right? So
Yeah.
I knew what these things looked like, and they're beasts, man.
Oh yeah, and they'll come rooting through your stuff. I imagine,
Yeah.
like if you have food out. And
So that's what I was most worried about. But pretty much for the whole trip, the hogs were the biggest worry, and then when you get out of the south, they're non-existent, so it's not a big deal.
But it is interesting. I think we'll touch on it probably as we continue to discuss it. But the adaptability that you have to have walking a trail like this, because
Oh, yeah.
when I think in a lot of adventurers in this club or people that like adventure in general, a lot of times you're prepping for very specific circumstances and scenarios. You know exactly the kind of wildlife you're going to be dealing with. You know exactly the kind of biome, the weather, the environment you're going to be facing, and you can kind of hand pick and prep your gear, your preparation, your training, whatever you're going to do for those specific challenges. And the idea that you're going to be walking this trail where the challenges are probably changing by day in some cases is pretty dynamic.
Yeah, so to touch on kind of the logistics, when you're walking, the Appalachian Trail, you can take a road into town. You cross a road, you can take the road into town, right? And the Postal Service will do what's called general delivery.
Yeah.
So I can address a package to Rich Mayfield in care of general delivery, or just general delivery, Rich Mayfield, Harper's Ferry, right? And when I get to Harper's Ferry, I can go to the post office and I can say, my name's Rich Mayfield. Do you have any general delivery packages? I'll hand you the package.
Yeah.
Right? So there's an opportunity to have stuff shipped to you and to ship stuff away. So what I would do, I would trade out gear all the time, frequently.
Yeah.
I'd say I planned on having this thing, but this is a waste, right? This is dumb. So drop it in a post office box, send it home, and then I had my parents on call, right? And I had one of my buddies that had access to my gear storage locker where all my stuff was. So if I needed something, I could be like, hey, Matt, throw that in the mail, send it to, whatever town, right?
Yeah.
And then when I'd look ahead and be like, okay, it's going to take them like a week to do this. I'll be in this town in a week, so send it to this town.
So I have to imagine, and we'll get it again, not trying to get too far ahead of ourselves, but by the end of your journey, you're probably pretty lean and mean in terms of knowing like what worked, what didn't, what you needed.
The gear, my gear was pretty tuned in.
Yeah.
So like I'm a gear guy. I started out with a bunch of stupid stuff.
Yeah.
That I thought was cool. But
I love that process. I
Yeah,
think
it's a fun
adventurers love that
process.
process
Yeah.
of kind of figuring out what works, what doesn't, narrowing down exactly what you need to be successful.
So I spent a lot of time researching. I put together a kit, and a lot of that got swapped out. Like 50% of it didn't work. So the kit was pretty, and I still have a lot of this stuff.
Yeah.
And it's part of my basic kit, right? Because you use it all the time.
Yeah.
Basically, anything that you're not using, you get rid of.
Yeah.
So you're using this day after day after day, it stays in the pack.
So the stuff you were left with was just hyper functional.
Yeah, but on the other hand, I wasn't exactly a minimalist, right?
Yeah.
Like I had a pretty heavy pack comparatively, because like for a while I had an espresso maker, because I wanted to have espresso.
Yeah.
And I used that thing twice a day. So it was getting used, you know?
Yeah.
So, but my rule was if it's not getting used, if I'm not using this thing every day,
Yeah.
or at least it's, you know, there's some stuff that, you know, you got to have like, you know, some medicine, right? Some like ointment, like sunscreen and stuff like that, that you're not necessarily using every day.
It's contingency stuff.
Yeah, but it's contingency stuff. And you're probably gonna, in the course of a week, you're going to use it, right?
Yeah.
But if I wouldn't use it in a week, it's gone.
Yeah.
Right? Because if I run into a contingency, right, I can always hit a road and hike out and go get the thing and come back. That's a pain in the butt, right? But, you know, if I'm taking that risk, like I don't want to carry this extra weight. What's the worst that can happen? I've
Yeah.
got to go get this thing. No big deal.
Yeah, you're not on the moon.
Yeah, you're not on the moon. Yeah,
Yeah.
you're the whole time when you're on the Appalachian Trail, you're actually fairly close to civilization, and you can go between, you know, normally between 3 days and a week between popping out to resupply on food.
Mm-hmm.
But I mean, ideally, you pop out, you get your food, you go back in,
Yeah.
right? And you don't have to mess around with like your, what do you call them, sundries, or like your hard gear,
Yeah.
right? Your non-expendable stuff.
Yeah.
Yeah. So when you leave the trail for provisioning, you want to try to make it as quick as possible.
Sure. And so now, you know, we've taken, you're come up from Florida, you're at the start of the Appalachian Trail. Is this maybe a good time to show kind of the montage you put together that's going to kind of give an overview of the journey you're about to undertake?
Yeah, so this is just something that I slammed together. Like, it's the only editing I've done on all this footage I took. I just put some interesting pieces together. I try to cover every state,
Yeah.
right, kind of in order, what it looked like, just like some clips so you can get an idea of like some of the stuff I saw. Because I mean, it really is phenomenal, all the stuff you see.
Oh, I'm sure.
Yeah.
All right, Andy.
Like to take this moment to say goodbye to the great state of Alabama. Southern terminus of the Appalachian Trail.
Yeah, we're not sure what mountain this is, but it's a beautiful view from up here. So we just hiked over that mountain, and then yesterday we did that mountain and those.
Wow. That's McAfee Knob in Virginia.
If you ever wanted to see what it looks like for it to be raining sideways, this is it. Storm subsided, and it's absolutely gorgeous up here.
Lots of fire towers in the kind of southern portion.
Probably later today I'm gonna have a giant rash on my hand.
This is High Bluff on top of Roan Mountain.
Were those fire towers manned?
No, they're all abandoned fire towers. Those are some wild ponies. That's the espresso maker.
And how much of these shots, especially these kind of shots, is it you kind of doing Survivor Man style where you set up the tripod, hit record?
Oh, like all of it.
Yeah.
Breakfast in Harper's Ferry.
That was a scary day.
Yeah, we'll have to touch on that.
Smoke on the water. It basically came straight up from that road down there.
A wild hair day.
You're supposed to go. Let me show you something here. It's right outside my door. This is definitely a dungeon, right? Oh yeah. Hello, beautiful. That right there is the peak of Mount Washington about 7 a.m. Alright, I figured I'd use just a little bit of video be climbing Mount Washington.
And I'm stuck.
Mount Washington's in the background. I thought I climbed it on a perfect day, but I'll tell you what, I wish I was on top of Mount Washington today. Because, well, it may be a little cold. It's probably about 29 degrees. There is zero wind. I mean, I'm on top of a bald mountain right now, and nothing. Absolutely still. Walk down that to get to that hut, just so I can walk up to that, so I can peek out. Maybe we'll get some video of me falling through the ice, which would suck, but it's pretty good so far. This is solid. I'm about to go summit Katahdin. This is the magical forest that is Baxter State Park in Maine. It's freaking snowing sideways up here! Ah! It's so hard! Oh! I'm officially in Canada right now.
Then I made it to Canada. So that was the whole trip right there.
Yeah. Well, I think
Andy, can you hit record for us real quick?
It is not letting me do that. That is unfortunate.
I think we good to go.
Yeah, see if you can fix that though.
I think there's a lot to touch on, even in that video. You know, small little snippets and like kind of windows into the experience. But one thing I'd love to kind of go back and touch on is a bit of the background of what instigated you to take this trip in the first place.
So when I was going through the process of getting geared up to go to dive school, you know, I'm swimming, I'm running laps, I'm doing pull-ups, like I'm getting in really good shape. So part of that is you got to go get an extra physical, right? A more in-depth physical. So I go get this physical, and the doctor reports, or I get this call from this like master chief that's like, sir, are you okay? I'm like, yeah, I'm fine. Why are you calling me on Friday, right? Why is this master chief calling me on a Friday?
Yeah.
He's like, you're not like lightheaded or like faint or what? I'm like, no. What's up? Why are you calling me, right? And he's like, well, your blood sugar is like 400. I'm like, well, I don't know what 400 means, man. I'm like, is that bad? He's like, that's like super bad. You need insulin right away. I'm like, whoa. Pump the brakes, Master Chief.
Yeah.
I don't know about that. I feel just fine.
Yeah.
So he's like, well, you have a good weekend. We just come in Monday and we'll deal with it. I'm like, what the hell, dude?
Yeah.
I'm like, so I have an okay weekend, and like most of it's spent Googling what 400 in your blood sugar means, which is bad, right? That's definitely bad. But I'm like, maybe I like ate a chocolate cake or something like that, right? Which, just trying to rationalize, right? So, long story short, got disqualified for submarines, right? Can't go underwater for a bunch of reasons. Kind of fought it back and forth with the Navy. One doctor would say this, another doctor would say that. But I can't go subs, right? So my Navy career is basically like a desk job from there on out. So when I got out of the Navy, I'm kind of looking to prove myself. I've kind of got like a chip on my shoulder, and I want to go on some big adventure. I batted some things around, and basically what I landed on was, let's hike from Key West to Canada. That sounds pretty cool. I had a buddy who had hiked the Appalachian Trail, right? So I knew what that was about. And I called him up, and I'm like, should I do this, or should I do like some sort of sailing thing? I'm like, and if the Appalachian Trail, like you did the Appalachian Trail, I obviously want to beat you, right? So like, how do I make it more badass?
Yeah.
And he's like, well, if you have time, if you want to leave like right now, you could do the Eastern Continental Trail. I'm like, well, what's that? He's like, well, you start in Key West and, go all the way up through Canada. I'm like, oh, sweet. I'll do that. So that's how it got started, So I kind of packed up all my stuff, for those adventurers out there, they know, like when you're getting ready, all the stuff goes in a storage unit, right? So I put all my stuff in a storage unit, kind of packed up my life, got rid of all that unnecessary stuff and took off.
And you just knew that was going to be probably your life for the next close to a year.
Yeah.
And so when you heard that news and you got that diagnosis, when you started taking, since it is going to be a factor in your journey up the Appalachian Trail, when you started taking insulin, did you notice a difference in your energy? Like once attention had been brought to the issue, was it like night and day all of a sudden once you started getting treatment that?
Oh yeah, like in retrospect, like the symptoms were there, right? Like there's always like a little chart on the doctor's wall if you go to an endocrinologist that's like, these are the symptoms of diabetes. And I'm like, oh yeah, I had that, I had that, I had that, I had that. I had all those. That chart should be in like a regular doctor's office, because having to be in an endocrinologist's office, it's like you're already there, right?
Yeah.
But yeah, like peeing a lot, like super thirsty all the time, right? Like not really gaining weight, even though I'm eating a lot of food, right? So you start taking insulin, and like immediately you're not peeing everywhere, right? Like you're not thirsty all the time, because basically what happens is when you're uncontrolled, right, you don't have any insulin in your system, so your body can't process carbohydrates at all, right? So my body, my pancreas stopped making insulin. So basically all the carbs I was taking in, a very, very small percentage of them get used. The rest of them just float around in your bloodstream until your kidneys filter them out and piss them out, right? So your kidneys are working overdrive to like filter out this extra sugar because it's not being metabolized. So as soon as you start taking insulin, like that stops. And you're like, oh, huh.
Well, I have to imagine it was probably an interesting combination of feelings where on the one hand, you know, here's this medical issue that has put barriers on your career aspirations, but if all of a sudden you're doing this treatment, you're feeling better and potentially more energetic or healthier, did that factor in at all to want to undertake this kind of journey?
Yeah, you know, I think you know, getting diagnosed as a diabetic is a kick in the pants to anybody, right? Nobody wants to hear that. It sucks. So, you know, to a certain extent, doing a trip like this is a way of coping with it, right? Just so you can, you know, show yourself that you can still do stuff and it's not like a death sentence. Because it's a chronic disease, right? It doesn't go away. It's not like you get the flu and you're over it, right? You live with it for the rest of your life. So, yeah, it's an interesting thought.
And was the physical challenge of these kind of long distance trails and hikes what kind of appealed to you about it? The idea that you were going to be out. Obviously, you said that you know you would have access to support if you needed it, but the idea that more or less you're going to be out in the wilds, moving under your own power, subject to the, you know, all the challenges of nature and the natural world, was that part of the appeal to you in terms? Because I have to imagine that. And, you know, being part of the Adventurers Club, you meet guys from all different stripes of adventure. You know, different things that appeal to different guys, whether it's scuba diving or military adventure or flying. You know, you get a lot of different passions. And I have to imagine that the passion to hike, the passion to day in, day out, wake up and know that your only objective for the day is to make however many miles, just to put one foot in front of the other, is a unique kind of impulse, a unique kind of drive. And what drew you to that specifically as a form of adventure?
You know, like I did a lot of stuff before this, right? Like I was a Boy Scout. You know, I did a lot of sailing. So I've been exposed to a lot of different like genres of adventure, so to speak. This one, you know, hiking, first of all, it's financially very easy, right? You don't have to spend a lot of money, right?
Yeah.
You're spending money on equipment, so to speak, if you want to do the real stuff, but you don't have to buy a boat, right? You don't have to buy a plane, right? And then it is this long. I think what drew me to it most was that it was a long-term adventure. Something like sailing around the world would be, right? That's another one on my list. Yeah. So I think it's not necessarily the hiking aspect of it as much as just the long-term, like being embedded out there, right? I think that aspect was what drew me to it the most.
Yeah, I can definitely appreciate that.
Yeah.
I think that's definitely an interesting aspect of it. So you've decided to take this journey. You've done the Florida portion, which is more than what a lot of people who are hiking specifically the Appalachian Trail do. And
right.
Now you arrive at the start of the Appalachian Trail. What is the environment there like? Are you connecting with people at the start of the hiking season? Are there a lot of people kind of coming into this area at the same time? Or what's the environment there when people set off?
So the Appalachian Trail, you know, has a season that you want to hike it in. And every year a bunch of people set out to do it. And you kind of have this class, right? Like the class of 2011, the Appalachian Trail. It's all the people that are trying to through hike it in 2011.
And just to clarify, through hikers are people that are going to hike it from the beginning to the end.
Yeah. So, you know, people go out to the Appalachian Trail and experience it in a wide variety of ways. Some people section hike it, which means that they're going to do a certain section. And then, you know, maybe they're going to add up all those sections to do the whole thing. Some people are just day hikers that are out there to hike and go see something.
Yeah, they live along the trail. They
right?
just want to come out.
They just park their car. They hike for the day. They come back. They're done. And then, you know, some people are doing long extended hikes. I think like Bob Oberto's out there right now, actually. I think he started like last week.
Oh, really?
He's going to try to do the southern section, right?
In the fall. He started in the fall?
Yeah, he wants to do the trail. He wants to see the turning of the leaves.
Okay.
So he wants to section hike it. And this is a good example of there's a lot of different ways to experience the trail, right? He wants to section hike it such that he's always hiking through the changing of the leaves, which is cool.
Yeah.
So there's all sorts of different ways to do it. And then there's through hikers that are like the elite, right? Or we think we're the elite that, are starting in the beginning and they're going to hike all the way up and do the entire trail in one go.
So I think it's an interesting thing, and we've touched on it also, that with a lot of different forms of adventure, there are these kind of subcultures that exist. There are subcultures amongst divers, subcultures amongst pilots. Is there, I'm sure there is, but what is the subculture amongst hikers, especially setting out from this goal that, and I'm sure you're meeting them, people who are eager to say,
Yeah.
I am a through hiker. I'm not just a day hiker. I'm not just here for a few days. I'm going the full distance. And what is the kind of subculture that emerges amongst those people?
So first of all, you can kind of suss out whether or not someone's a through hiker, like talking with them for 10 minutes.
Yeah.
Right? I mean, most of the time you can just see it in about 5 seconds whether or not they're a through hiker or not. Through hikers that have been hiking for even
Well,
just
I'm
a
sure,
couple
especially once
weeks or
you're on
whatever.
the trail.
Yeah.
You see these
You
people
look at them,
wandering in.
you can look how they walk, right?
Yeah.
Like through hikers are fast, right? They're not messing around. They're just they're like notably faster and more confident walking down the trail.
Yeah.
Right? There's people that say that they're through hikers and then you start talking to them and you're like, yeah. And then, lots of people start out and they don't make it.
Oh, I'm sure. As
Right.
the through hikers start out, that there are people that are filtering off the whole way.
Oh yeah. Yeah. So there's a huge attrition, right? But once you get into it a little bit, you can kind of tell like who's actually in it to win it, so to speak, and who's going to fall off.
Yeah.
So it is an interesting culture, right? Because you kind of move in pods, right? There can be like a group of people that kind of like move together along the length of the trail, and that can change. Like people can move ahead, people can fall behind, and then you might fall behind a little bit, and then like there's another group that you meet up with, and you hike with them for a while. So you're kind of moving in and out of these social groups, and the whole trail is based upon like the shelter system, right? So along the trail, there'll be a shelter and there's stopping points, right? Like here's water, like it's a watering hole, like old school style,
Yeah.
right? So everybody meets up at the watering hole. So normally you're not spread out across the trail in this like even fashion. Like everybody is meeting up at the watering holes.
Yeah.
So you're hiking with people and again, during the day, someone might be a mile ahead of you, but then, they stop and you catch up to them and, you hang out and, then you keep going. And then eventually you make it to a shelter and everybody's camping at the shelter and someone starts a fire type thing. So it's a really interesting social dynamic.
Well, I think that is interesting. When you were on your trail, did you make any kind of long-standing relationships or at least recurring relationships with people on the trail as well, where you'd come into camp and see like, oh, I remember you. Like we caught up here, however many miles back.
And so another interesting aspect to it is there's logbooks at all the shelters, right? So when you get to a shelter, you sign in, and it's helpful for a variety of reasons. You can see who, it's basically like so and so was here, right, and had a bad day. There's a freaking rat in this shelter, right? Someone needs to kill that thing. So like there's all sorts of stuff in the logbook, and you can kind of look at who's ahead, right? You can be like, oh, so and so was here a couple days ago. I'm gonna go catch up to him.
Yeah.
Or whatever. But yeah, you meet people, and if someone's hiking at kind of your same pace and they're kind of into the same stuff, you'll kind of stick with them and be like, hey, what are you doing tomorrow? You're going to that such and such shelter? All right, let's do that shelter. And you kind of start to stick with people just for the camaraderie of the whole thing.
Yeah. That's very cool. And speaking of shelters, I think you even touched on it in the video. It looked like there was a variety of quality, size of shelters that you would come across.
Yeah, so like a shelter is a tree house, basically. But not a tree, it's not in a tree, right? But it's basically constructed like you would construct a tree house. So the most basic Appalachian Trail shelter is 3 walls, right? And then they have a floor. Now, it used to be back in the day, in the early days of the trail, it was just 3 walls, right? And then some beams. And at the beginning of every season, the first hiker in the shelter would basically be responsible for chopping down some saplings and making a floor.
So setting up the shelter for the hikers coming
Yeah,
behind.
exactly. So you would come into a shelter and someone had cut a bunch of saplings and put down some branches on top of it to make a bed. Now what they have is basically plank wood floors. So it's a 3-sided box, right, with a roof and then a floor, and that's it. That's your basic. Now in certain areas, people get super creative and they'll make like these, multi-story tree houses and stuff like that. And they'll kind of get crazy with it, and you'll come upon the shelter and you'll be like, oh, holy crap, look at this thing, But the standard one, which is like, it's just another shelter, and it'll tell you in the data book like how many, like what type of shelter it is, right? So the standard one sleeps like 8 people.
Yeah.
So, and maybe it has a fireplace, maybe it has a fire ring outside of it, but it's pretty varied in what you come upon.
Well, one thing we had touched on before, kind of talking about this, was the dynamic that they do sleep 8 people, or at least have limited capacity.
Right.
That could lead to some drama on the trail, where you have all these different groups and all these different levels of hikers that are using these shelters, which is, I guess, free use for anybody that comes upon them.
Yeah.
And how do you sort that out when you have a through hiker who maybe has been on the trail for months on end, who's just looking for a safe place to post up for the night, versus some people that came in from like the local town that were looking for a Saturday night getaway?
Oh, for sure.
And,
it's
and
a
how,
huge
how do you
deal.
balance those dynamics of?
So, I mean, first it should be noted that through hikers aren't really trail maintainers or shelter builders, right? Shelters are built by local chapters of the Appalachian Trail Conservancy that, they want to make the trail nice and they want to build a shelter, right? So these are local people that like the Appalachian Trail and they're building shelters, right? Through hikers believe that they're God's gift to the trail and that they should have priority in the shelter. And, you know where that comes from, right? You just hike 20 miles, right? You need a place and you need to lighten your load. So maybe you drop your tent and you don't have as much stuff, right? So shouldn't you have rights in that shelter?
Yeah.
The fact of the matter is first come, first serve. So, if you don't get to that shelter in time, or if some group of high schoolers wants to come up there and party and drink on the weekend, right, and just camp on that shelter for 3 days, yeah, it can be a problem.
Yeah.
So, I mean, people get pissed off. So normally a through hiker will show up and just like cuss under his breath and then just like stomp off into the woods, right?
Yeah.
And they'll either continue hiking on the trail in the dark or, set up a tent or whatever, or just be pissed off. There was this guy, I remember, he, I knew him, right? So I knew his story was valid. So I was ahead of him, right? And I was at this shelter that was crowded. And the previous shelter was crowded too. So he got to that shelter and it was slammed. He didn't have a tent, right? He had dropped it to save weight.
Yeah.
So he hikes on to the next shelter. He shows up with the one that I'm at. And it's slammed too. And he was just livid. He's like, all these effing shelters, like all these day hikers out here using the damn I'm like, hey man. So again, like he just kind of like huffed off into the woods and presumably hiked for another couple hours.
So he finds the next shelter.
Yeah,
which
yeah.
hopefully had some space for him.
But yeah, there's large groups, and in the high season, like these shelters can be pretty impacted.
Well, I think, and you mentioned hiking at night. Did any of this ever factor into your planning? Like in terms of, did you ever set out, like, I'm going to set out real early in the morning, I'm going to hike part of my day in the darkness at night to try and get to shelters earlier, to try and in some cases, depending on what the environment was, to hide from the heat or whatever it may be. How did the game all factor into your planning?
You spent some time with indigenous peoples, right? Do they ever hike at night?
Not generally, no.
No, never.
Yeah.
Indigenous people never hike at night,
Yeah.
right? And there's good reason for that. You can't see where you're going, right?
Yeah.
You can't see, you can't navigate, right? So generally, if you're hiking at night, I guess if you were hiking across the Sahara, right, and you could navigate by the stars, this might be a good idea.
Yeah.
But generally, if you're hiking at night, something went wrong.
Yeah.
There's some people that are like, oh, I'm going to night hike. But generally, you were sitting around during the day, like swimming in the creek or whatever, and you got a late start, but you still wanted to make your goal, so you're hiking at night with a headlamp. But generally, anytime you were hiking at night, like, it was not a good experience for me. All night hiking was a bad experience for me.
Gotcha.
I mean, every once in a while, like, you come out and you see this view, right? And it's just like stars, and you're like, oh, this is amazing. But I mean, you can get that sitting at the shelter too, right?
Yeah.
Most of the time,
there's
it's
never
just-
any intention of like, I'm going to
Yeah.
set out at 3 a.m. or 4 a.m. and try
No.
and beat everybody else to the shelter.
I mean, sometimes you'll think about that, like, but I mean, it's not like 3 a.m. It's just like as soon as the sun's up, boom, I'm out and
Yeah.
I'm gone. But the thing is, even if you get to the shelter first, there's still going to be like 20 more assholes that come up behind you.
Yeah.
And that I don't know, that wasn't a great experience for me. So if I ever found myself in a pod that was just a little bit too big, I would try to either speed up or slow down to like get out of that. It's kind of
Yeah.
like driving on the freeway, right?
Yeah.
You know, like you get in little groups of traffic
Yeah.
and you're like, I don't want to be in here. So you
Yeah.
speed up or you slow down. Most of the time I speed up, right?
Yeah.
So it's kind of the same thing when you're hiking. You want to get out of that pack.
And then if you weren't able to stay in a shelter that night, if you had to default to the gear you had, did you pack both a tent and a hammock? And if you did, which would you default to if you had the choice? Are you a hammock guy or a tent guy?
So I went back and forth between the two, right? The hammock and tent, kind of depending on where you're at, right? Obviously the hammock's super lightweight, right? You normally have to have a tarp over the top of the hammock to keep you dry, right?
Yeah.
Because the dew and the mist comes down and it'll get you wet, right? Even if it doesn't rain,
Yeah.
you'll wake up wet. So I went back and so tarp hammock, right, versus tent. I much prefer a hammock if there's not bugs out. So that's the other thing. You know, like like mosquitoes and bugs. When you're in a hammock, they can get at you. So now you got to add like a mosquito fly. So
Yeah.
and it just kind of gets complicated. And you've got to do like the lightweight hammocks that I would use, right? You still have to have a pad under you to insulate you, because if you're sleeping on your sleeping bag, like you compress that down, and then your butt's hanging out and your butt gets super cold.
Yeah.
Right, because it's up in the air. So you got fluffy down on top of you on your sleeping bag, but you're compressing it under you. So you got this really thin layer of insulation on your butt, so that'll get cold. So now you got to put a pad in there. It's kind of weird sleeping on a pad. There's people who put together whole hammock systems, but it gets complicated, and at some point you kind of like lose the cool factor.
Yeah.
So if it's temperate, right, and there's no bugs, hammock all the way.
Yeah.
But otherwise, the tent is just so much more protection against the elements.
Interesting.
Yeah.
It is fun. And I don't know if you've experienced the same thing, but I've noticed amongst some of the adventurer type people that I've met that there are people who love the hammocks. Like I was on a trip with a guy who had like sciatic pain, and the hammock was like a godsend to him. He didn't even know it was gonna be, but he's like,
Yeah.
oh my gosh, my back pain went away sleeping in the hammock. And we eventually got back to our hotel after the trip, and he was still slinging his hammock in the hotel
Oh, they're fantastic.
to relieve his back pain.
I love them.
And there are other people that just like something about the bend just cannot sleep in a hammock.
So-
they just toss and turn and it can't get right.
When you sleep in a hammock, you're supposed to sleep diagonal. If you're shaped like a banana, you're doing it wrong. So you're supposed to sleep
doing it
diagonally
wrong,
across it, right? And if you sleep and this is the only way you can do it if you're camping, right?
Yeah.
Because you got to get that pad under you.
Yeah.
If you sleep diagonally, it slings you in such a way that your back is straight.
Okay.
So what I ended up doing actually is I got like a super lightweight hammock.
Yeah.
The heaviest part of this hammock was the 2 aluminum carabiners,
Yeah.
and I just kept that in addition to my tent. So if I had the option to hammock, I'd throw that hammock up.
There you go.
Yeah,
And then another interesting thing I heard about hiker culture is that everybody has trail names.
yeah,
So, which is an interesting kind of dynamic because I guess it dates back to the logbooks. Everybody's checking in the logbooks, and that's where the trail names kind of came from, was how you make your entries.
yeah.
So, A, what was your trail name if you had one? And B, what was kind of the culture of trail names in general? I mean, when you had these recurring people that you knew were on the trail at the same time as you, did you know them by their real names, or was it always kind of based around this trail name mythology?
Good question. It kind of depends on the person, right? So first of all, you're supposed to be given a trail name. You're not allowed to come up with your own trail name.
Okay, interesting.
Okay.
So who gives it to you? Just some other
okay,
hiker?
so nobody in Florida gave me one, right?
Yeah. Because you're the hobo to them.
Yeah. Yeah. What are you going to be? What's my trail name going to be? Hobo?
Yeah, bum.
Bum, right? So when I got to the AT, right, my story was I started in Key West. So my trail name became Key West. I forget who gave it to me, but it kind of took a little bit of time on the trail.
Yeah.
And I actually had kind of like people knew about me. I'd be like, they're like, okay, Key West. You're the guy that started in Key West. I'm like, yeah. So, it all means something, right? Like, shoot, I forgot what we gave this. There was one guy that had like half an arm.
Yeah.
So obviously we gave him some like one-armed bandit type
Yeah,
name,
yeah.
right? There's no shame in it, right? And
Yeah.
he's like, yeah, we did all stuff. I remember we butchered a rabbit one night, which we butchered this rabbit, right? The one-armed guy it got a rabbit stick. You know how a rabbit stick works?
No.
So rabbits, if they get hit with something, they just like,
It just stuns them. And
they just stun and they just lay there. So basically all you need to catch a rabbit and eat it is a stick, like kind of a heavy stick.
Yeah.
So he wings this rabbit stick that he whittled across the ground, and he gets this rabbit, and he comes into the camp, and he wants to butcher this thing, but he's got one arm, right? So he ends up with this bloody stump, right? And I think that I can't remember what we gave him for his trail name, but that was the night he got it, because he had butchered this rabbit, and obviously, like, his hand was holding a knife, and his stump was holding like this rabbit trying to butcher it. And he was very adamant that he would butcher this rabbit on his own.
You didn't need any help.
So he winds up with this bloody stump of an arm. We got a picture of it somewhere of him like, someone holding an axe and like he's got like a missing arm.
Yeah.
he was a very good sport about it all, right? I mean, I don't know, how else can you be like a diabetic, right? Just it is what it is, right?
Yeah.
So the culture of trail names is such that someone has to give it to you. I got lucky that mine was kind of cool, right? There's this one guy, Littlefoot, and I'm like, why are you Littlefoot? And he slaps his feet up there. He got like one foot's like 3 inches shorter.
Like noticeably smaller.
Like
yeah.
noticeably smaller, right? So it's just a nickname, right?
Yeah.
Like a call sign. And you sign it in your logbook, and people get to know you by that. As far as like, how do I know people? There's a couple people that like huge hikers that have done like a ton of trails that weren't into trail names. They didn't go in for that nonsense, right?
Yeah.
So I just know them by their first names. But everybody else, 90% of the people, I just know them by their trail names.
So then do you keep your trail name? So if you ever were to hike another famous trail, would you bring over Key West now that you've been christened?
Yeah.
Or do you get a new name each trail?
Yeah. And then, people always ask, they'll be like, you got a trail name yet? And you're like, yeah, it's cute. How'd you get a trail name? Who gave it to you? And be like, oh, well, I got it on that AT.
There
like,
you go.
oh, okay. Because people would try to come up. It's like people try to make their own nickname,
Yeah.
and you can't make your own nickname.
There's some you can tell like if it sounds like a little bit too
Right.
cool.
You're like, that sounds too cool.
A little bit too dramatic. It's like, come on, gave you that.
Come on. Who gave you that name? And you're like,
Yeah.
oh, well, it was like, no.
Some guy.
No. Yeah. So, I mean, it's a whole culture thing.
Yeah.
Right. And you can't fight it. Right. It is what it is.
Well, it's kind of similar, I'm sure, and I'm sure it's different from being a potential submarine officer, but in the Navy, call signs and stuff like that.
Yeah, I
where
mean,
they're kind of given to you, and they're not always the most flattering
Yeah.
thing. There's always a kind of a
I mean,
backhanded.
pilots get call signs, right? I don't think anybody else in the Navy gets call signs.
But I do know from what I've heard is that you don't give them to yourself. They have to be given
For
to
sure.
you, and a lot of times,
For sure.
they're not necessarily. They might sound cool, but they're not always the best. The reasoning behind it is not always
Normally,
badass.
someone's making fun of you.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, that's normally how it goes.
So Key West, I mean, that's pretty solid.
Yeah, I have a problem with that. I
Yeah.
mean, I was kind of like, when I first, I'm like, okay, fine. Because
Yeah.
I was kind of hoping for something like else. I don't know what it would be.
Yeah.
But it was just like, oh yeah, you're the guy that started in Key West. I'm like, Eric started in Key West, but Eric wasn't into
Maybe
trail
that's a comment.
names.
You're the guy.
Yeah.
You're the guy who started in Key West.
Yeah. So that's how that works out.
Sure. And one thing you touched on kind of talking about that is the interesting challenge that you faced dealing with being a type 1 diabetic. Your journey and the logistical considerations that you had to make were probably much different than most people on the trail.
Yeah, so obviously, if I don't have insulin, I die. Well, maybe not right away, but stuff goes south for me very quickly.
It's an important
Yeah,
thing to consider.
So I would have to, at the time, what I was doing is multiple daily injections. So like one sustaining dose in the morning or at night, and then like little booster doses throughout the day.
And
so to
are
speak.
you having to carry fresh syringes for all of these, or is it?
Yeah, so what I did is I carried pins, right? They have these pins that like are adjustable. You can adjust the dose, and then you put like a little tiny needle on the tip of the pin. And so it's less waste, right? Because otherwise you'd have to carry a syringe, and technically you're supposed to, use a new one each time.
Yeah.
Some people like recycle, but it's not the best. And like with sanitation being what it is, non-existent out on the trail, right?
Yeah, I'm sure.
So I use these little tiny needles that went on the tip of the pin. So you dial in your dose and you put it in you. So what I would do is I would have to, basically I still have like a fairly extensive stash of insulin. Like I don't have like 3 months worth of insulin. I have a lot, right?
Yeah.
It was one of the first things I did when I learned that I would have to take insulin for the rest of my life. I made it a point to establish a large stockpile, right? So I moved my large stockpile and its associated fridge, to my parents' house because I trusted my parents more than any of my friends. I was like, okay, my parents aren't going to let me die, right?
Yeah.
So I moved it to their house.
They're gonna move some insulin out to put some beer in or something
exactly.
like that.
Yeah. It's not going to be like, oh man, like, we had to take it out of the fridge because, we had a party and like,
We haven't put it in for 6 days, but
all
we
the
put it back
natty
in
bow
now.
wouldn't, yeah. So like, I moved the fridge to my parents' house, and basically what I do is I when I'm running out of stuff, I'd make a list. I had a Kindle, right? And I bought the Kindle that had the internet connection on it, so I could send like emails, like text emails. So I'd type up a little email on my Kindle, and I'd say, I need this, this, and this, and please send it to this town. And they'd send it to a town that's like a week ahead.
Yeah.
Get to that town, go into the post office. Any packages for Rich Mayfield? Here you go.
Well, you had mentioned before, because we were touching base before the interview, that part of the challenge of the insulin is that, and you can express it better than I can, but you were running kind of high in terms of blood sugar.
Yeah.
Because so many of the snacks that we associate with like trail snacks or any kind of endurance snacks are like, number one, like super sugar heavy, super carb heavy, and that's something you're struggling, while you're taking these, trying to stay nourished on the trail and have enough energy to meet your daily goals.
Yeah.
There's a whole nother element there.
So from the nutrition aspect, it's interesting and it's difficult, right? Because you are expending a lot of energy on the trail. And the deal is without insulin, your body makes insulin fine. It's on autopilot, it works great.
I hope so.
So when you take in any sort of carbohydrate, right? That carbohydrate gets converted to glucose in your bloodstream, right? And then that glucose needs to go from your blood into your cells, right?
Yeah.
And then once it's in your cell, it can be used for energy. Like your muscle can use it for energy, right? But when it's in your bloodstream and not in the cell, right, it's not doing any good. So insulin regulates how much glucose moves from your bloodstream into your cells, okay? So if you don't have insulin, none of that sugar, the glucose, moves into your cells, okay? So when you're you're balancing three things, right? You're balancing how much sugar you have in your blood, and that's a function of how much you eat, right? How much carbohydrates you eat. You're balancing the amount of insulin you have, which regulates how much is going into your cells. And then you're balancing how much your cells are asking for, right? Because your cells have this demand, they need energy, right? Mm-hmm. So you have to balance how much you're exerting yourself, how much insulin you took, and how much sugar you ingested, okay? So, if your blood sugar goes low, you can just pass out, right? If it goes high, chronically over the course of your life, if your blood sugar is always high, you get all these diabetic complications that we associate with people like losing a foot or like, eyesight going bad or whatever, right? But you're not going to pass out on the spot. Going super high, you can actually go into a coma, but it's hard to do if you're being so active, right?
So in this case, it made more sense to lean high.
Yeah, so
than lean low.
I would lean a little bit high, right? Because
Yeah.
I didn't want to pass out on the trail. The problem with leaning high, right, is again the sugar's in your bloodstream and not in your cells, so it's not being used. So you ate food, you made it into sugar, and now you're going to pee it out,
Yeah.
right? As opposed to using it for energy, right? So you're wasting food basically.
Yeah.
On the other hand, a couple times I would go too low, and basically the only remedy to dropping blood sugar is to eat more sugar. Well, I've got a bag full of food, right? And when you're going low, you're freaking out, right? You're like, oh shoot, my blood sugar is going low, and you're getting like this adrenaline response, right? Because when your body senses low blood sugar, it pumps a bunch of adrenaline into you to give you some more energy, right? So you're having this adrenaline response. You're sweating. You're kind of shaky. You're like, I need sugar. And then there's this bag of food, and you just start eating, right?
Yeah.
So there are a couple times where like I eat, and wake up the next morning, and I've got like oatmeal packets because I didn't go after the oatmeal packets, but like all the rest of the food's gone. Like the peanut butter's gone, the bread's gone.
Yeah.
You know, the Snickers bar that I had for an emergency is gone. So then I'm like, oh, what do I do now? So, you know, I got to make an unplanned stop. It's like, okay, so where's the next road? I guess I'm taking that road into town.
Yeah.
You know, because I'm like, well, I was an idiot. You know, I overcorrected because oftentimes what happens, and diabetics would know this, you know, you go low and you eat to correct that, to bring your blood sugar back up, but you don't just eat what you need.
Yeah.
You eat like an idiot. And then your blood sugar skyrockets in the other direction, right? So then all that's wasted.
Yeah.
And then you have to take more insulin to bring it back down.
Yeah.
So it's this balancing act the whole time, and it's pretty difficult, but the one saving grace is the more active you are, the less insulin you need, and the more your body, like, you get a bigger buffer, right? When you're sedentary, like, everything's really hard to keep in band. It's really hard to keep it stable and controlled, right?
Yeah.
You got to be very careful. But when you're super active, like, your body kind of gives you some leeway,
Yeah.
right? So,
Well, you had mentioned that a lot of this trip was connected to, you know, learning about this diagnosis, doing some self-discovery, kind of, you know, pivoting. And you'd mentioned you had a Kindle and reading some books along the way.
yeah.
What were kind of the books and the narratives that you were kind of interested in and kind of building around yourself as you undertook this really lengthy journey?
You know, I read a lot of different stuff. I started with a lot of the adventure books. You know, I reread Huck Finn.
Yeah.
It's just a fun book, right? I read some Hemingway books. When I was in Key West, I actually stayed like in his house.
Oh, in Hemingway's house?
Yeah, well, like, it's a hotel, right?
Yeah.
So like, I made it a point, like, the night before I started my trip, I'm looking at hotels. I'm like, well, shit, man. Like, this one's like a mid-range hotel. Like, everything else is like, I'm not gonna stay in this dirtbag motel, and it's like $100 a night. I'm gonna do this one.
Yeah.
Right. So that was kind of cool. So, you know, I read some Hemingway stuff, Old Man in the Sea. I read Tom Sawyer and Huckleberry Finn. So, like, some classic adventure tales. I read some, like, economics books and some stuff, like some nonfiction, because I'm a big nonfiction guy. And then I read some, like, dirtbag books. Like, I think we were talking about it earlier. I read this book, like, I Hope They Serve Beer in Hell.
Yeah.
You just no good books like that, right? About, like, rapscallions. It's like the millennial Hunter Thompson, but not as good as Hunter Thompson.
Yeah.
Right. So I just read some, you know, fun books like that.
So as you were going and talking about especially those books, you know, I think it's interesting, especially because they're very American, like Hemingway and Mark Twain. You know, probably the most American authors you can associate with. As you're going on this journey, which ultimately I can imagine there is a level of monotony to it. You're seeing all these beautiful things, all these new regions, but each morning you just know that your day is going to consist of putting one foot in front of the other. Were there any messages or takeaways from those books or themes that you really picked up on that you connected with as you were undertaking this really lengthy quest?
I mean, you know, I think I read Walden somewhere up in the Northeast, right? Like somewhere in the northern portion, and a lot of that resonated with me because just a lot of thinking, man. Like you're with your thoughts a lot.
No, I'm sure.
You know, even when you're hiking in a group, you're not hiking like next to your buddies, right? They're a couple hundred yards ahead. If they're a couple hundred yards ahead, you're hiking together, right?
Yeah.
Like that's like hiking close. You're not like in conversation distance most of the time. Most of the time, you're by yourself, right? So there's a lot of time to think. It's a lot of time just outdoors in nature, pondering stuff, you know?
Yeah.
So it could be monotonous, but you know, you're always with your thoughts, and like, you know, like reading and journaling and stuff like that. Like I kept a journal. It kind of gives you an opportunity to get those thoughts out and kind of think through some stuff. Looking back, every once in a while I'll reread my journal and, I'll remember this mental state that I was in, right? You look at this and you're like, oh yeah, I remember when I was having those ideas. Those were stupid. Just like all sorts of stuff. Like, you talk about like political ideations, right? Like, oh, I've got an idea, and then you write it down and you think you're God's gift to like politics. And then you read it later and you're like, that's a dumb idea.
Yeah.
So there's a lot of that going on where you're just like ruminating over all these different ideas and stuff like that, waxing poetic and being all philosophical in your own head. So that's an interesting aspect to it. That definitely happens. Go crazy? Yeah, sure.
Well, and how much of it too, and we talked about this as well, is adventure is such a weird niche kind of experience these days, because the classic golden age of exploration and adventure where you're literally putting a region on the map that did not exist before, that's kind of long gone. So in most cases, when we as adventurers go out into the world, you're traversing areas, land, oceans, whatever, that are well traveled at that point. I mean, even you hear about stories about Mount Everest where there are traffic jams up to the summit. And being on such a well-hiked trail, like the Appalachian Trail, I'm sure there was an element of that as well. What do you think personally, especially having, set out for this very personal experience and having had what I'm sure is a very personal experience on the trail, what is your takeaway from that in terms of being in an area and being on a journey that many people have gone on, but that you yourself personally have never gone on? And how do you kind of reconcile those two realities?
That's interesting. I think that's the difference between, adventure and exploration, right? A lot of what we do here at the Adventure Club is adventure, and it's very egocentric, right? It's about a journey of self-discovery, right? For instance, if someone goes to that Sing Sing Festival at Papua New Guinea, an amazing experience, completely well documented. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
There's, Planet Earth did a documentary on it.
Yeah.
You can see it. So why do you go to do that? Well, it's about you, right? It's about an internal journey, so to speak.
Yeah.
It's about you learning about yourself, and I guess kind of challenging some ideas that you might have, or coming up with new ideas and basically forming your own brain. But I think a lot of adventures is pretty egocentric. Like it's about you, right? You could go to some other place, but if you don't have a scientific objective, what's it about?
Yeah.
If not you, right? And that's not to say, there's plenty of scientific objectives that are still out there.
Yeah.
But putting something on the map is not really one of those. I mean, it used to be a scientific objective to figure out what's on the other side of that ridge, or figure out what's at the top of that peak. That used to be a scientific objective. That whole category of science isn't there anymore, like finding out what's there. I mean, except like the bottom of the ocean.
Yeah, or like some deep, deep jungle someplace, maybe in South America.
Yeah, but even like the deep, deep jungles, you've been there, there's people there.
Yeah.
And there's people, and when you meet the people, they're like, yeah, we've met people. Like, we know about people.
Yeah.
They have guns, they have, metal implements and stuff. So, so what I strive for in adventure is I try to go somewhere that's just really hard to get to.
Yeah.
Right? That's kind of, there's a lot of beautiful stuff, and for better or for worse, the United States has a lot of beautiful things, but our park system built roads through it to that, so automobiles could drive to the beautiful stuff, right?
Yeah.
And that's cool, and it's cool to see that. But really, what makes things special for me is if it's hard to get there, right? It's not that nobody's been there before. I realize someone's been there before. And shoot, man, you can go to the moon and guess what? Someone's been there before.
Yeah, you're gonna find boot prints and
Right.
a flag.
Obviously, you can explore ridges on the moon and all that. Not a perfect analogy. But what really gets me excited about adventure is just somewhere that's hard to get to that very few people have seen.
Yeah.
That you have to exert some sort of energy to get there. Not anybody can get there.
Well, I have to wonder too, and I think most quote unquote adventurers have experienced this, when you kind of would make these detours into town, what that experience was like, where that you've been on the trail for months and months. you've had this very unique experience and you know, a unique way of living that most people are not privy to, and you come into town and like, how do you relate? What's your relationship to other people as you kind of go along this journey, and you have these kind of detours into civilization in between going back out to these long stretches, just being very much on your own?
I remember having a distinct sense of badassery.
Yeah, yeah. The
Just
little bit
like-
of that like jaded kind of 1,000-yard
I'm
stare.
a badass, you know, I've been out here, you know, where were you last night?
Yeah.
You know?
I was out in the woods.
Yeah, I was out in the woods. I've been hiking for days through the snow, you
Yeah.
know? So you develop that kind of attitude,
Yeah.
right? It's just, I mean, again, you know, it's like, I don't know if Wayne White's watching, right?
Yeah.
Like, I'm sure when Wayne White comes back from his South Pole, you know, he's been to the South Pole like through the winter,
Yeah.
right? Comes back, is like, what the hell did you do?
He's
You know?
got some swagger. I'm
Yeah,
sure.
what the hell did you spend the last 3 months of your life doing?
Yeah.
Right? So you kind of, I distinctly remember getting that feeling.
Yeah.
Right? And you go into town and you're like, but you know, you kind of have to have some self-awareness, because when you walk into town, you're just like this smelly homeless person that walked in.
Yeah.
And again, on the Appalachian Trail, the towns know the score.
They're used to the smell of
Right.
homeless people.
They're like, and kind of like when I went through some of the northern towns, I was kind of behind the season.
Yeah.
So it was really cold. They're like, oh, you're still hiking, huh? I'm like, yep. You know, still going. So, you know, I wasn't the main group, but they know. And, you know, to be fair, like the pejorative for people through hiking is hiker trash, right?
Yeah.
Because we look like homeless people. And we smell like homeless people.
Yeah.
And for all intents and purposes, we are homeless people, right?
Yeah.
And so, you know, most hikers are very respectful of the town they're going through, right? Because people are coming from all walks. But there are dirtbag hikers, right, that abuse the town. You
Yeah.
know, go into town, get a bottle of liquor, you know, get shit-faced and, you know, throw the bottle against a building or something.
Get in
right?
a fight with somebody.
Yeah, get in a fight or whatever, you know. So there's that stuff happens, and that kind of sours it for all the other hikers that come through. But you know, these towns have been on the trail for so long, and they know what it is. So they know that all hikers are not like that. They're like, yeah, that guy's just an asshole. And then the next person, so they're used to having they're used to hikers being tourists, right? It's like
Yeah.
a town that has a lot of tourists.
Sure.
And they recognize that hikers are tourists and not homeless people.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And then one thing that's interesting about how you classify hikers that we had talked about a bit was, and I think it's broken down, we talked between like white phasers,
Blazers. Yeah.
blazers, yellow blazers, and I think in a way maybe you can connect it. Like one of the things you showed in the video was coming across what looked like almost like a flash flood. Mm-hmm. Like water just rushing through this forest. It did not look like a natural creek bed or river. And I think, you know, one thing we kind of touched on is that how you travel the trail is almost as important as traveling the trail in the first place.
Yeah.
And what was your approach to that in terms of how people look at that, what it means to travel the trail, and then when you come across these unexpected environmental situations or you know, roadblocks or logistical snags that nobody could account for, how do you pivot and adapt to them while maintaining the integrity of being a Appalachian Trail hiker?
So I do want to tell the story about that stream that was overflowed.
Yeah.
But first I'll explain the blaze. So a blaze is a mark on a tree or otherwise indication of where the trail is, right? So the Appalachian Trail uses white blazes, white rectangular blazes on a tree, right? So it's basically just a white square painted on a tree. The Florida Trail uses orange ones, you know, because Florida oranges and all that. The Pacific Crest Trail, I think, actually uses the symbol, right, which is more difficult to draw. But Appalachian Trail, you know, a bunch of Appalachian hillbillies, just white mark on a tree,
Just a
right?
stripe.
Yeah, there we go. Okay, so there are some people that hike the trail that believe that you have to touch every white blaze, otherwise you did not do it, right? They're the purists.
So a hands-on.
Well, I mean, you got to pass the tree, right?
Okay.
You got to see, you got to put eyes on every single white blaze.
Yeah.
And they're purists, hike the whole trail, right? So there's these other blazes called blue blazes, right? And blue blazes are normally created. It's a side trail that bypasses a peak, and it's done for safety reasons. Basically, so if the peak is weathered out, like if there's lightning, thunder, or whatever, and it's not safe to be up on the peak, or if the trail gets jacked up, you take the blue blaze around the peak, right, and you cut off that peak. Well, that's a little bit easier.
Well,
right?
one thing I think it's important to understand too, and you were explaining this to me, is that the Appalachian Trail essentially is just a route tracked along, in some cases, the highest altitude
Yes.
route. Like it's not a convenient
Yeah.
thing of like what's the most convenient trail from Alabama or wherever it starts.
Couple things
up
about
north.
that. The goal of the Appalachian Trail Conservancy, the organization that manages the trail, is to put that thing on the ridge.
So they're putting you in inhospitable conditions.
Right on the ridge. It's a ridge line trail.
Yeah.
Right? And the other thing is, the Appalachian Trail was built by a bunch of hillbillies.
Yeah.
So, if Billy Bob needs to get from point A to point B and he lives in those hills, he might just walk straight up and over the hill. So, not a lot of switchbacks.
Yeah.
Right? A lot of just straight up the freaking mountain and straight down. So take that for what it's worth.
But that's probably
it's
one
a
reason why the
pedestrian trail.
purists
Yeah, so
care so much, because in some ways maybe the purest route is probably in some ways the most difficult route.
it is. Well, and most of the time it's over a peak, right? So the purists are hitting every blaze. So then you have these other people, that guy's blue blazing it. That means he's kind of slacking off, right? Or that guy's a yellow blazer, so that means that he
That's
took
the
the
worst of
road.
all, right?
Yeah, yellow blazers, they basically take a taxi, like a yellow taxi, or walk down the road, right? To kind of because the trail will be doing this meandering thing, and you're looking at the map and you're like, why the hell am I walking all the way over there to walk all the way
here's the
back?
interstate.
I can just take this little road and go whoop, whoop.
Yeah.
So people are doing that. So yellow blazers, and then there's pink blazers who are just like, they found a girl on the trail and they're just following her wherever she goes. So there's all these different types of people, and they're enjoying the trail in their own way, right? But there are some purists. So where do I land in that? I just basically tried to follow the trail, man.
Yeah.
Like if a peak was like, I'm climbing to the peak.
Yeah.
But if there's thunder, I'm freaking taking the blue. That's what it's for.
Yeah.
Like that's why it's there. I'm not going up there. Like there's some. You saw that clip.
Well, that's what I was
The
going to get
rain.
to, is in some cases, it's like, that all makes sense. But in some cases, there is no, I'm sure, it looked like, again, based on that clip, there was no way around that washout.
So let's talk about that. That was a pretty significant hurricane happened in 2011. And like New Jersey and basically the upper eastern seaboard just got slammed, like real bad. Well, so I was out in that. I was hiking along, and
See, that's type 2 fun. In retrospect, you're probably glad that, the year you hiked was the year that had all these horrible hurricanes.
it wasn't too cold, right?
Yeah.
Because hurricanes are a warm thing generally, right? It's the warm energy, right, is what's fueling it, right? So it's pretty warm. Like I was hiking shirtless, right? Because I didn't want to get my shirt wet. It was just, everything you wore is going to get soaked, right?
Yeah.
So I'm wearing my little hiking shorts and that's it.
Yeah.
Right? And there was one other guy that was coming south, and he was the same way. We're like, man, this sucks. But that was probably the most dangerous experience I had.
Yeah.
On the whole trail, because if you looked at that clip, and I don't know if it was that one, but basically these ravines, right, normally have a little creek running through them, and you just step over the creek. Well, there were areas that were just torrential.
Yeah.
And in retrospect, I'm like, oh man. So what did I do? I hiked upstream, and I found an area where it was wider, right? So where the trail crossed, it had kind of necked down, and that's kind of where you want to trail to cross, because when there's not a lot of water flow, right? Where is the water? It's in the deep canyon type thing, right? So when you have a deeper ravine, that's where the water is going to be. So you cross the trail there, and you cross a water point, so you can fill up on water. Well, in a torrential downpour hurricane situation, that's completely impassable. It's 4 feet of water moving kill you speed. So,
Yeah.
you hike up to it and you're like, whoa.
Well, I'm sure it's also uncertain ground underneath.
Yeah, you don't know what's
what
under
you're
there.
stepping
Rocks,
into.
trees, all this other stuff. So I hiked north. I beat through the bushes and then found this area where this stream was 100 yards across. but it was still like 3 feet deep.
Yeah.
You know, for 100 yards, it's 3 feet of just like, you know, trees coming down through it and all this stuff. It was probably super dangerous, but I made it across.
Yeah.
But it reminded me, so like down in the Everglades in Florida, or in some of the swamps, you're in knee deep water, or 3 feet water, or whatever, but it's calm, right? It's moving. The Everglades is the slowest moving river, right? Or the swamp is just basically stagnant.
Yeah.
Right. So you're picking through stuff. You're picking through the swamp, but it's not moving. So this was this big like sheet flow of water, like 3 feet deep, and like if you stand there, like you're against a current.
Yeah.
So in retrospect, I was like, man, if like a tree came down or something and caught me up or something, that would be crazy.
Or even if your footing gave away.
Yeah, and then I
Potentially.
get swept down, and
Yeah.
I wind up like underneath, like entangled. Yeah.
And what state was that where you hit that specific stretch?
I want to say that's a good question. I'd have to look back.
Because it is interesting to imagine, especially
Maybe New Jersey?
as you go north, the changing, not just the changing environment, but also the changing culture. And it's interesting that you have this kind of through line of the trail, so I'm sure a lot of the towns and stuff we're acclimated to hikers and people like that. But did you notice a distinguishable difference in terms of culture, people that were accepting you? Were there states that were more polite, states that were less polite?
Yeah. No surprise, New Jersey's the worst.
Really?
People are the worst there.
Yeah.
The worst. One saving grace, I remember that there was an ice cream store in New Jersey that was
So not only were you fording that river
freaking
potentially.
amazing. There's
New
an ice
Jersey.
cream store that was like very close to the trail, like maybe like 1 mile off.
Yeah.
Like, so the data book says like, take a left, go 1 mile. There's an ice cream store. I'm like, hell yeah.
Yeah.
So that ice cream store was amazing, and the people were fairly nice there. I stole a bunch of paper towels from their bathroom and, cleaned up.
Can you steal a paper towel? I guess, depending on how many you took, I guess you can.
I mean, you're supposed to like wash your hands and use like 1 or 2, right?
Yeah, you're taking full
So if you're
rolls.
doing this, if you're making multiple pumps of the paper towel dispenser and shoving it in your backpack,
Yeah. You're like the guy taking too many free ice cream samples.
yeah, whatever.
Give me a taste of that.
I,
Give me a taste of this one.
I ate like 3 Sundays or something like that. Took a ton of insulin.
Yeah.
But Jersey was the worst. I mean, everybody I encountered in Jersey, like, stereotypes true, right? Like, if you're trying to buy a sandwich, I had a hassle with this guy. I'm like, hey, can I charge my phone? No. What the hell, dude? Like, what do you mean I can't charge my phone? Like, I was asking, like, rhetorically.
Yeah.
Like, do you mind if I charge my phone? He's giving me a hard time. I guess that's just their personality, right?
Well, I'm sure also by that point in the
I'm
trail.
like, I just bought 2 $12 sandwiches. I bought your most expensive sandwich, and I bought 2 of them.
Yeah. But I'm sure by that point in the trail, a lot of people have probably fallen away through attrition. So, I mean,
Yeah.
in a way, I'm sure as you go farther and farther north, the trail culture or the hiking culture kind of starts to diminish a bit.
Yeah,
and
that's
you
interesting.
start to become more of the bum.
Yeah.
As opposed to the hiker that's
Well,
like part of this large group.
That being said, the nicest people were in Maine.
Interesting. So as far north as you can go.
Yeah, I remember when I came into Maine, it was right before the 100-mile wilderness, right, which is a 100-mile stretch of wilderness with nothing, right? So normally, 100 miles will take you like a week, right? So that's like a long stretch not going into town.
Yeah.
Because like 3 or 4 days you want to pop in. So this is a longer stretch. So right before, there's this place in, I don't know what the town is, but it's called the Lakeshore House. And I came into, so Lakeshore House puts up hikers, right? They have like a, what do you call it? Like a hostel situation going on, like a bunk room.
Yeah.
And they have a laundry, right? Which is super important.
Yeah.
So you can launder your clothes. And they got a restaurant with beer on tap. So, I see in the data book that, so-and-so gives you a ride in, So I call this lady up, and it's after the season. And she's like, "You're hiking?" I'm like, "Yeah." Like, "Isn't it cold?" I'm like, "Yeah, it's very cold." It's very cold. I'd like to.
Ma'am, it's very cold.
I'd like to, book a stay, and if you could come and pick me up at the trailhead, that would be great.
Yeah.
So she comes out and she's like, "We had pizza, like, so we're done with it, So here's a half a pizza." So she comes in her minivan with her kid and like throws me a half a pizza. I'm like, "Thank you." So very hospitable up in Maine.
Yeah.
Got to wash my clothes, reprovision. She ran a little store too. drank some beer, ordered like every meal that you order in a restaurant, you order like 2 entrees, right?
Yeah.
And then that was like my last send off into the 100-mile wilderness.
At that point, are you still seeing hikers, or is it really starting to trail off?
I was pretty far behind because I like to take my time and do fun stuff along the way.
Yeah.
Like for instance, I remember this place in Tennessee. There's some gap that had like a bunch of like outdoor cool stuff to do. Like you do whitewater rafting and zip lining.
Yeah.
So like, and then there's this other place that had like hot spring hot tubs.
Yeah.
So like every time there was something to stop and do, I did it.
Yeah.
Like if there was any sort of attraction,
That was worth like diverting.
Rich Mayfield was there.
Yeah.
I was like, if there's something to see, I diverted for everything, right?
Yeah.
So that being said, it took me longer than the standard 6 months. So when I was getting up north, there weren't a lot of people left. So like, I remember I got like the ranger called me and left a message because there's a river crossing, right? And traditionally, what you're supposed to do, they say, don't swim across the river. And I was like, look, I'm not swimming across the river. It's cold, right? But I guess in the summertime, some people try to swim across the river, but they're like, don't swim across the river. There's a boat operator, and there's this guy who's his volunteer gig or whatever, what he likes to do is he ferries hikers across the river, right? Well, I was going to be super late. So I email this guy. I'm like, hey, I'm coming in late. Like, can I still get a ferry ride? I know like you're closed or whatever. I don't hear back from him, right? And I head off into the 100-mile wilderness, right? I didn't hear back from him. So I'm looking at it. I'm like, well, I'm not going to walk to the river and, not have a ferry ride. So I guess I'm going to have to, like, I can go down to this dam, right?
Yeah.
And I can walk across at the dam and then walk back up, right? And it's going to be like 20 miles out of my way. So it kind of sucked. So I did it, right? So I walked around. And then, kind of got out of the 100-mile wilderness, and I popped into a lodge, right? Because I had to get out, like I'm running low on food and everything. And I pop into a lodge, charge my cell phone, fire up the email. So this guy had gotten my email, and he had showed up to give me a ferry ride, and I hadn't been there. But I had no confirmation, right?
Yeah.
So he's got this hiker coming out of the 100-mile stretch in the middle of wilderness. He showed up. I didn't show up. Right,
So he alerted the ranger.
So he alerted the ranger. So I get this message from the ranger, like, are you still alive? I'm like, yes, I'm still alive. So I called him back, and I'm like, yeah, I
That's
didn't
kind
die.
of endearing, though. In
Yeah,
a weird
it's
way,
nice.
it's like, oh, the system works.
Yeah, they're watching out for hikers.
Yeah.
So that was near the end of my trek.
Yeah. Well, at this point, it sounds like you're getting up towards Maine.
Yeah.
You're getting up towards the Canadian border. And where does the Appalachian Trail terminate? Is it pretty close to the Canadian border? Because I know there's some unofficial trails that continue up even farther north.
Yeah. So the Appalachian Trail ends in Baxter Park at the top of Mount Katahdin, and that was the video we showed of me hanging onto that sign, right?
Okay, so that was kind of you completing your mission, your goal.
So from there, but I wanted to make it to Canada, right? And
Yeah.
Baxter Park is like smack dab, like it couldn't be more right in the middle of Maine. So from there, they have this thing called the International Appalachian Trail, the IAT, that continues on. And it continues on from Baxter Park. And like there's some, it's again, not well developed, but some trails, mostly like snowmobile type trails and stuff like that, that goes into Canada. And then after the Canadian border, it goes up to like Newfoundland.
Because although it's like to Greenland to some degree, right?
Yeah. So I forget where the IAT terminates up there in Canada, but that was my goal. I just wanted to hit Canada, right?
Yeah.
So I had thought about a couple different places. Originally, I had thought about Kent, which is the northernmost point in Maine. But then I was like, man, I just need to get to Canada. Canada's far enough, no matter where it is. If I just hit Canada.
Point, how long have you been on the trail?
Like 10 and a half months.
Jeez, that's a long time.
So I looked to this town called Holton.
Yeah.
Right? Interestingly enough, that's where the 9/11 terrorists crossed over. So they're not too nice at that. They're nice enough at that border crossing, but it probably wasn't the best choice, right? So what I did is, I kind of took this IAT and kind of tried to make my own route around some train tracks and kind of like planned to route through the wilderness as much as I could. Lots of train tracks. And I made it to Holton, right? And I basically walked down I-95 across into Canada. And the Canadians were like, hey, you know?
So you didn't check in officially.
Well, I checked into Canada. And
Okay,
I was
so you
like,
did check,
can you
you did
stamp my
border crossing.
passport? They're like, we don't really you're an American. We don't stamp your passport. I'm like, look, it's kind of important for me to get my
I've been on the show
passport.
for 11 and a half months.
Yeah, I'm like, it's
for this
important.
stamp.
It's important for me to get this stamp.
Yeah.
And I explained to them, they're like, really? I'm like, yeah, for real. Can you? So they stamped my passport. I bought some stuff at the gift shop. And then I walked back down the freeway to America. I got surrounded by like, I don't know, like 11 dudes, right? Because I mean, here's a homeless guy walking across. And it's a freeway, right? 95 is a freeway. So it'd be like if you're crossing Tijuana on the 5
Yeah.
walking.
Yeah.
So I'm like, you guys, I just walked across. Like, didn't you see me going that way? And so I explained it to me, and so they surrounded me and brought me in, so to speak. And I sat down in there, and I don't know what they did. Like, it took maybe 20 minutes for them to figure out that like this stuff that I was telling them was actually true. It's like, I just hiked from Key West, and I came over, and this is a culmination of this giant trip, And they're like, looking at me like, is this guy serious? So they run my passport and, find out that I'm not, a terrorist or whatever.
Well, I'm sure it helped that you were in the Navy.
Yeah, I don't know.
Yeah.
So, I get back into the United States and go get a haircut, fly home.
So what was that feeling like? You've come to the terminus of your journey. You've made it this far. You say you've been on the trail for almost almost an entire year. When you come to this point, does it end with a bang? Does it end with a whimper? Is there a moment of kind of cathartic reflection? Did you find what you were looking for? What is your takeaway as all this kind of comes to a close?
It's interesting because it didn't end on the summit of a mountain, right? It ended with me crossing the border at this weird point, right? But that being said, there was a marker that was like a border marker that said U.S. and Canada, and it had a line, right? And that was the official line. So I knew, and there was this official, stone
identifier
monument,
Yeah.
right? That I could step across. I could step across this line, but it wasn't like it's not like summiting a mountain, right? It's just
Yeah.
crossing in this, on I-95 in the winter. You're just stepping across and nobody's there. But it was, I'd been thinking about it for so long. I was on this trip for 11 months, just thinking about getting to Canada.
Yeah.
So when it happens, you're like, holy shit, I did
Yeah.
it. Did I really just walked all that way? Well,
Yeah.
minus 500 miles on a bike, right? But I really just went all that way to get up here.
Yeah.
And like I had, I forget the exact mileage, but I was keeping track of mileage every day. It was like 4,017 miles or something like that. 4,000 was one number and 17 might have been 4,100 or something like that, right? But it was a huge distance. And I stepped across and it was just like, oh, wow,
Yeah.
that's a big one.
But there was a moment, because it always makes you think in a weird way about almost like that scene in Forrest Gump, right, where he's running and he just kind of stops.
Yeah.
And it's like, I think I'm going to go home or whatever. It's like that kind of moment of like whatever switch flipped in his brain that whatever he was chasing, whatever he was after, he had found and he was kind of done.
Yeah.
Did you have that moment of kind of clarity or completion, or was there an element of that there was more left to find, maybe you had found what you were looking for way before, that you realized that I found what I was looking for back in Jersey, and like all this was extra.
I mean, it could have, the completion of the mission was big for me, right?
Yeah.
I got to make it to Canada. Again, like at a certain point, like when we started this thing out, I was like, yeah, I'm going to go up all the way through Canada and go to the, Atlantic Ocean in Newfoundland. But then at some point I was just like, Canada's far enough.
Yeah.
I'll figure it out by Canada. And then, as I'm getting up there, I was like, well, Kent would be cool because northernmost point of Maine, southernmost point of Florida. Okay. So, I keep kind of paring it down a little bit, but I never lost the whole, like, I'm going to go Key West to Canada.
Yeah.
Right. So, sure. Could I have cut it earlier and still learned, sure.
Yeah.
But I mean, I wouldn't feel complete. But I mean, the fact that I stepped across the border to Canada,
Yeah.
like that solidified it for me.
Yeah.
Before that, like I was done with the hike way before that.
Yeah.
Like when I had gotten, Maine was beautiful. Maine is probably my favorite part of the trail. Maine, Smoky Mountains, Virginia, Tennessee. Those are my favorite. Shoot, it's all great. New Hampshire's great. Vermont's great. But those are the highlights.
Everything but Jersey.
Everything but Jersey. Connecticut's not bad. Massachusetts isn't bad. New York wasn't bad, but it wasn't phenomenal.
Yeah.
Right. New Hampshire was phenomenal. Maine was just absolutely gorgeous.
Yeah.
Right. So kind of like after I got my Maine fix and I was just walking down these railroads for a couple hundred miles. Right. So you're walking on a railroad for 200 miles to hit the Canadian border. By the time you hit it, you're done. I had made my mind up. But I mean, it's like okay, so I've gone like 4,000 miles, right? I've got like 100 miles left to go, and then I make Canada.
Yeah.
Like I'm done, right? But I'm done once I make it to that border.
Yeah.
Does that make sense?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And especially once you put, like you said, 4,000 miles on what's an extra 100.
Yeah. Well, I mean, it's a lot.
But after 4,000, it's kind of like.
Yeah. So you're not going to stop then, right?
Yeah.
It's like, come on, I'm not gonna puss out at when I
at the
come so
finish line.
far, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. But I mean, I was done.
Yeah.
Like I wasn't gonna be like, oh, I'm gonna go further,
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, I mean, thank you. You've taken us along the whole journey. This, like you said, from the southernmost point of Florida all the way up to the Canadian border, almost a year worth spent on the road, which is, coming from somebody who's only ever been on adventures in the space of 2 to 3 weeks is hard to even imagine being out for that long. And with that, I'd refer to Andy. Do we have any questions from the audience about Rich's journey?
We sure do. Pretty lively in the chat tonight. Thank you all for making it out and tuning in after the debate. There's a lot of stuff going on tonight. We're glad you could join us here. First question comes from Sinclair. Thank you for the question, Sinclair. Sinclair wants to know, how long did it take you to save up money to go on the trip?
I had some money saved, and I had some credit cards. So I think I had about 15 grand saved that in a retirement.
Yeah.
Retirement. I don't need to be saving for retirement at 26 years old.
Yeah.
Right. So I spent all that money, and then I put some on credit cards for sure. Kind of once I was into it, I had some unexpected bills along the trail. Like I had a rental unit and I had to pay for an air conditioner. So that sucked. So in full disclosure, it did set me back financially a little bit. There's lots of different ways you can do it, right? I spent about as much money as anybody could. I bought the gear that I needed to buy. I bought the light gear. When something wasn't working, I bought the piece of gear that would work. I wasn't frivolous, but if I needed something, I bought it.
Yeah.
If there was a restaurant and it had the food that I wanted, I bought the food. You don't have to do that. You can go to the grocery store.
Yeah.
Right. But if I was in town, right, I'm buying my instant oatmeal. I'm buying my dehydrated meals. I'm buying some bread. I'm buying some Spam. I'm buying some peanut butter. Right. And then I'm sitting there. I'm like, okay, so before I go back to the trail, I'm going to eat at that steakhouse.
Yeah.
So there's an extra $40. Again, because you're eating for two.
Yeah.
I would go to a place that has a big fat American meal, and I would order 2 meals, easy, and not even feel full. Just start walking immediately afterwards. Take a big shot of insulin and go.
But you also mentioned that in terms of adventure sports, that hiking is pretty accessible financially.
Yeah. So you don't have to do that, right?
Yeah.
But I did, and like I said, I would stop at everything, right? I'd stop at. Oh, you got whitewater rafting here. Sweet. Sign me up. Oh, there's zip lining? Sweet. Sign me up. I would do everything that there is to do.
Yeah.
So you can do it a lot cheaper than I did it.
Yeah.
In terms of outfitting, for gear, you need a backpack, you need a tent, you need some clothes, right? I took a spot messenger, that little satellite messenger.
Like a Garmin type thing?
Yeah,
a
that's like
GPS?
$100, right? And then it's
Yeah.
$100 subscription, and it comes with like rescue insurance, which I was a big fan of because I was like, if I've got to get medevaced out,
Send
right?
a helicopter for you.
Yeah, if I need a helicopter, like I don't want to have to pay
Yeah.
for it, right? So the outfitting yourself in a kit, you could probably be set up pretty well for like $2,000, I would say.
Yeah.
Like not having anything. So you buy a tent, you buy a backpack. Those are your big expenses. They can be like $200-$300 for nice ones. Sleeping bag can run a couple $100, and then like stoves and stuff like that. The big expense is going to be food along the way.
But I guess that's what's kind of nice about the Appalachian Trail is that it's scalable.
Yes.
Depending on like how much
For sure.
you want to invest. Like you could, by all means, go and just do part of it.
Yeah.
Or set out with a set budget and say, I've got this much money to spend. I'm going to see how far it takes me.
Yeah. So one of our members right now, Bob Roberto, from what I understand, is doing the southern part. His goal is to go from Springer Mountain to Harper's Ferry right now,
Yeah.
and he's doing it right now. So you can do it in sections. You
Yeah.
don't have to take. It took me 11 months because I went from Key West to Canada,
Yeah.
and I stopped and did every single thing along the way.
Yeah.
Right? So Bob going from Springer Mountain to Harper's Ferry, that may take him, 2 to 3 months,
Yeah.
which is a summer, right? Summer vacation.
Well,
If-
this is great. It's a great entry point
Yeah.
too. For people that want to get into this world, want to get in that experience, you can take it in bite-sized chunks. You don't have to dive right into the deep end, kind of like you did.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And for me, even I enjoy anything that I'm out for like more than a week. If I'm out for more than a week, I'm really into it because
Yeah.
it gives me that time to get immersed in it.
Yeah, it becomes your new normal.
Exactly. And again, once you get over being dirty, once you get over all that kind of stuff, right? When you set it, this is my normal. That's when you get comfortable and you really start enjoying yourself.
Yeah.
Right. When you're worried about all the all the things that aren't comfortable about it, you're not having fun.
Yeah.
Right. Once you get over that and this is your new normal, that's when you
Or if
start
you're doing
to-
like a countdown. If the whole time you're out there, you're only out there for a week,
yeah.
and you're breaking out, like you do the work week, like, oh, this is my hump day. Like,
Right.
After
Or
this, I'm
I've
counting
gotta
down to that
make this-
shower.
I've got to make 20 miles.
Yeah.
Or I'm behind on my mileage or whatever. Yeah. You start enjoying it more at that point.
Absolutely. All right, Andy, are there any other questions?
There are a few more questions. Thank you for asking. Next question comes from Jay Nunn. Thank you for the question, Jay. Jay wants to know, is bearded, long-haired Rich going to make a comeback?
No, so I noticed that hair's pretty thin on top here, right? So I noticed in some pictures from behind that I've got fairly thin hair. So I decided to go with this hairstyle for the rest of my life. As far as the long beard, it's a pretty aggressive look when you have like a shaved head and a big beard. When I did it on the trail, like it kind of looked normal in some of the pictures that I look back on, but I remember on the trail I was like, dude, I look pretty scary.
And the people, you should join the Hells Angels or
the
something.
people I was with, I remember one night I was like, dude, I'm gonna shave my head, and they're like, do it. Lots of support, and I shaved my head, and they're like, dude, you look scary. Maybe you shouldn't have done that. So I don't think the long hair is maybe a long beard at some point. Who knows? But I mean, it's pretty thin up here, so I think this is my look. This is my best look I can go for.
Maybe if you're ever out on the trail again, though,
Yeah,
the beard and the kind of bandana look,
yeah,
it's not a bad look.
yeah. That's why I wore the bandana so I wouldn't look freaky. Come into town and be like, holy crap, who's this guy?
You don't look like some Walter White guy.
Yeah,
Coming to town
Yeah.
to like stir up trouble.
yeah. I do like that beard though. Looking back on it.
Great
All
to
right.
know. Next question comes from Sinclair. Sinclair wants to know, what was your average pack weight?
Oh, that's a really good question. It started out pretty heavy. Like I think I started out. Okay, so there's like your dry weight and your wet weight, right? I don't know if that's the precise term, but your dry weight is your pack without food and water. Okay, and then you add food and water. So I was at so on the Appalachian Trail, there's water everywhere. So I would never carry more than a liter of water. So rough math, 4 liters is a gallon, which is 8 pounds, right? So 1 liter is like 2 pounds of water. So I'd have 2 pounds of water, and then the food would normally run like 5 or 6 pounds. We'll call it 6. So the wet weight would be like an 8-pound pack. right? 8 pounds worth of food and water
Yeah.
going out, right? So I was at about 32 pounds wet when I was dialed in. So that means that my actual dry weight of my pack would be, what is that? 24 pounds?
Yeah.
So like 24 pounds of stuff, which is fairly heavy for
Yeah.
lightweight guys. We've had some guys in the club that are like super lightweight packers. They got that thing down to like 12 pounds,
Yeah.
right? Super, super light. But I like to be comfortable. Like I freaking had an espresso maker,
Yeah.
But I used that thing and it made me happy, so I kept it. There's some stupid stuff that I didn't use. I don't know if, throw that picture up again, Andy.
You got it. 2 seconds.
I got this Kelty pack on and this, there's espresso. Go back to the other picture. I got this Kelty pack on, which is actually a pretty lightweight pack,
Yeah.
right? For all the innovation that has been made.
Is
like
that it looks like a pretty serious trail knife you got hanging off the
yeah,
side there.
that's what I wanted to show. Worthless. That was 2 pounds of complete garbage.
Yeah.
So that went away. It was there. It made me feel good through Florida or whatever for like dogs and boars and stuff.
Or
Never used it.
Anacondas, boa
Never
constrictors,
used it
whatever you
once.
find.
Not once. Never got used. I think I cracked open a coconut with it in Florida. That's the only time that ever got used. 2 pounds of worthless weight.
Yeah.
That's the type of stuff that you bring that weighs that pack down. But that Kelty pack treated me pretty well. You'll notice that there's a tent on there. Above the tent, there's a sleeping bag. Then there's clothes. And then there's food on top. And then the other packs have basically small first aid kit that had like tweezers and like super glue and some medication in it. And
So I'm curious,
that's their
in this
Kindle.
photo, were these other people with you? Were these just other trail hikers that you met?
yeah, I don't remember the guy in the middle. I don't know who he is. But this guy on the right, I don't remember his name either. But we hiked with each other I remember his dog's name. His dog's name was Nala, like from The Lion King. But he had this black lab. We hiked together for a while. Until I wanted to go whitewater rafting and ziplining for 2 days.
Yeah.
And then we split up. But yeah, we hiked with each other pretty much from Georgia. I met him coming into the Appalachian Trail in Springer, coming up to Springer Mountain, and we parted ways somewhere in Tennessee.
Gotcha. Well, and another interesting side note about the Kelty pack is, I believe as club lore goes, that one of our members was kind of one of the original pioneers of the Kelty pack.
We got a bunch of
We got some of the early prototypes
over here.
sitting right behind you.
So it's basically the exact same pack, and it's fairly lightweight. It's
Yeah.
no slouch of a pack. Like even though it's an external frame, it looks kind of old and janky. It's pretty lightweight and it's pretty functional.
But it's pretty interesting to think about the through line of that
Yeah.
here you are prior to even probably hearing about the Adventures Club,
Oh, yeah.
using this technology, and you come here.
I
and
mean,
this
I
is where
didn't.
it kind of
I
originated.
used that pack for a little bit. It wasn't my favorite pack.
Yeah.
My favorite pack is the Osprey Atmos.
And is it braced, that pack, or is it
Oh
more
yeah,
just...
yeah, but it's an internal frame pack.
Gotcha.
But again, that pack was a great pack. Shoot,
Yeah.
it's cheap.
Yeah.
It's like under $100.
There you go.
Like the Osprey pack's like a $270 pack.
Yeah.
That thing. First of all, it had a ton of volume.
Yeah.
And it was very utilitarian in like how you could strap stuff to it. I love that pack.
Yeah.
Just the Osprey was just a little bit better.
There we go. Do you still have that original pack?
Yeah, I have all the packs. Yeah,
Maybe some of those packs should make their way to this club.
I don't know about that.
Well, we'll see. All right, Andy, any other questions?
For sure. And just so folks know, the member that pioneered the pack, Bob Silver, was a personal friend of Dick Kelty, who invented the backpack and was also a member here. So if you ever want to see one of the original Kelty backpacks, come on by. We'd love to show it to you. Next question comes from Sinclair. Sinclair wants to know, what tent did you use?
So I used the REI Quarter Dome T2 for most of the trip. I've got an MSR one that's a similar design too. Interesting. I always used a 2-person tent because it was more luxurious.
Yeah, spread out a bit.
So the 1-person tent, I might have had a 1-person tent I might have had the T1 for a little bit, right? But in terms of the weights, there's a weight savings, right? That the 2-person tent weighs several ounces more But if you look at that, you're like, man, that's not a lot of ounces. That's like not a lot.
Yeah.
It's not a lot of weight. And having the extra spot next to you to have your pack, so in a one-person tent, you have to have your pack on the outside, right, in the vestibule.
Yeah.
And it's out of the weather, but it's not out of the mosquitoes, and like mice will get in that thing and whatever, like I like to have my pack inside. So I always did the two-person, and I used the REI Quarter Dome, which I think is a great tent.
Yeah.
And funny, I bought my REI Quarter Dome T2 when REI still had like the lifetime, like no shit warranty.
Yeah.
Right? And a couple years ago, it fell apart. Like it delaminated, the glue fell apart, and I was like, this is garbage, because they use some garbage glue. Like I know glues, and like there's cheap glues and there's good glues, and if you use the cheap ones, after a couple years they fall apart. So this thing fell apart, and I call them up. I'm like, hey, and they gave me the runaround about the warranty, and they don't do that anymore. And they're like, wait, when did you buy this tent? I'm like, 2010. And they're like, for real? I'm like, yeah, look it up on my account. They're like, oh, yeah. Well, in 2010, we had the unconditional lifetime warranty, so we'll get you a new tent. So I was able to get a new tent eventually. Like, I had to kind of like strong arm REI. But
fight for it a bit.
Yeah, but they replaced that tent completely. And it's a great tent, like, functionally. I can't say much about the glue. I think they cheaped out on the glue. Because, again, good glue lasts for a life. But, like, the cheap stuff will give you problems.
But the warranty panned out. You got
It did.
fancy new tent.
It did. It was kind of a pain in the butt with REI.
Yeah.
REI is not what it used to be. Like I said, they used to have like unconditional, and I don't know why they stopped doing that. Probably because people took advantage of it, like me, turning in a tent 10 years later after 4,000 miles.
This tent broke.
But that's the thing. This tent lasted me 4,000 miles on the trail, and I took good care of it, and it was immaculate. When I finished the trail, like it was my tent, but it was fine, right?
Yeah.
I pull it out, like, and I used it a couple times later. Like a couple years later, I used it, and then I put it away for a couple years, and I pull it out, and it was just like disintegrated. Like, what the hell is that? If I took it on a trip and it got like beat to death in a hurricane, I wouldn't file a warranty claim.
Yeah.
But it was just sitting there, and after all I'd been through with that tent, I was like, come on, man.
That's I don't know what it is. It must be that SoCal heat or something.
It's bad
Melted
glue.
the glue.
It's bad glue. It's what it is.
All right.
Next question in the chat comes from Jay Nunn. Jay wants to know, how did your relationship with being in the moment versus wanting to finish change along the way?
That's a good question. So I was pretty much in the moment all the time. A lot of the moments sucked, right? Like I think you saw, I was really looking for some videos that showed night hiking, which is the worst. But you saw that one of me like twisting that sign around, because I got to that peak, right? And you come up to the top of the peak, and there's a sign that's supposed to point in the direction you need to go.
And the thing's just free twisted.
Right? And I know I don't need to go back that way.
Yeah.
But in terms of like trails going up to peaks, sometimes trail go up to a peak, and then it kind of like does, like not a 180, but pretty close, and comes down almost the same way. So you really rely on those signs to be like, oh, where do I go? Or there's multiple trails to the top.
Yeah.
Well, I need the one that's going for another 1,000 miles, right? I don't need to go down this other trail that goes to, like Billy Bob's Holler, right?
Yeah.
So like the signs are really important. So getting lost at night, I'd have issues like just being pissed off, right? So a lot of it's enjoying the gorgeous views, but there are a lot of moments of being really mad, not being able to find the trail.
Yeah.
Or just otherwise pissed off. And I don't know if that ever made me want to quit. It didn't really make me want to quit. It just made me pissed off that I didn't know where the trail was.
Well, how much was that? You always hear about like type 2 versus type 1 fun, right? Like you've heard that distinction?
No, what's the type 2 versus type 1?
So from what I've heard, the type 1 fun is where it's like fun during and it's fun after. And then type 2 fun, which is like most adventure travel, adventure sports, is like where it's not fun at all.
It's definitely like 90% type.
But after, you're like, oh, that was pretty cool. Like looking back, you're fond of the memories. And so I guess the question in a way that maybe Jay's circling around is like, how much of your journey was moment to moment enjoyment versus looking back on it now saying that was a worthwhile experience?
It was like 10% moment enjoyment, 90% that was freaking cool.
Yeah.
Like I remember, I showed you a video of me crossing that pond that really quick thing, me crossing the pond.
Yeah, where you were terrified you're going to go collapse into the ice.
Yeah, that was the first time. I definitely fell through the ice in a pond. That sucked.
Probably was not type 1 fun.
No, but I mean, it was a cool story, right? And you know, it taught, like, I don't know, like, what do you survive, right? So I get, and it was like, I came up to my nips.
Yeah.
Right? So basically, you know, the ice gets thinner as you get closer to shore.
Yeah.
Okay? So I don't know about ponds. I'm pretty sure that this was the second most dangerous thing I did was crossing these ponds, right?
Yeah.
The first, that giant river during the hurricane.
Yeah.
Because of the debris and the entanglement. But the second was crossing these frozen ponds, right? Because, you know, they're frozen. It's cold out, right? I don't know how deep they are. I don't know what's down there. I'm trying to cross
And
this
you don't know how
ice.
thick the ice is.
I don't know how thick. I don't know anything about ice. I know
Yeah.
nothing about. I'm from California.
Yeah.
I know nothing. Like, you know, Emilio Estevez and the Mighty Ducks drives the limo out on the ice. I don't have that expertise, and it's not even that cold out. It's barely a crust.
Yeah.
Like, I definitely walked out there on some ice ponds, and it was like I like saw the crack go across.
Yeah.
So this one time I was coming across this pond, and this is definitely the type 2 story or 1. Which one is it?
Type 2 is where it's like terrifying during and afterwards you look back on it fondly.
Type 2.
Type 2.
So I'm coming across, and I make it across the pond. I'm like, thank God.
Yeah.
Right? And like 4 feet from the shore,
Yeah.
right through, up to the nips, ice cold water, and I claw myself out, and it's muddy and icy, and I claw myself out. I'm just like, what do? Well, you hike like a mofo, right?
Try and warm yourself up.
Yeah, I hiked as fast as I could until I got back on the trail, and I got to a spot, because you know when you're hiking, you don't want to stop at you want to stop at a good spot that has some rocks to sit on and blah 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 blah.
Yeah.
So I get back to the trail, right? And because where the trail crossed, that normally you would hop over some rocks.
Yeah.
But those rocks were covered in ice and snow, and you couldn't tell, you know. So you didn't want to cross at that point. So I was crossing the pond. So I get back to the trail. I bushwhack, you know, I'm all cold, and I just hike as fast as I can. I get to a good spot to stop. Take off all my clothes, right? Like, as soon as I stop, I'm like, all right, this is what I'm going to do. I'm going to strip down, take off all my clothes, put on all my drive stuff, right? And I think there was one piece that I had to keep wearing, right, to get my body heat to keep it dry. But basically swapped everything out and kept going. And then what I would do for the next day, because again, like, I have to dry these clothes out, right? I can't just have frozen stuff.
Yeah.
Right? So I would swap in like one piece of clothes at a time.
dry it out
To
as
dry it
you're
out with
hiking.
my body heat.
Yeah.
So I'd like do the shirt. The shirt was pretty fast because it was like a Tech Wick shirt,
Yeah.
right? You know, I just went through all my stuff until it was all dry.
There you go. Well, I think I don't know if it's like official. I don't know if the type 1, type 2 is official, but I imagine there's like a type 3 and type 4, where type 3 maybe is like where it's fun during but not fun after.
Yeah.
Where it's like in the moment you're like, this was cool, and then after it's like, that wasn't that cool.
I mean,
and
what
maybe
I've
type 4 where it's like never fun.
And this
It's
is
just
where the
the
adventure
worst
comes
all
in,
the way through.
right? Like, I would prefer that I got to that creek and there'd been like a nice bridge over it, right? But I mean, hey, that's not adventurous.
There you go. But looking back on it, you look back on it
Right.
fondly. Like, I'm glad that it was a bit hard.
Or like there was this river that like it'd be easy to cross in the summer, you know, because you just wade through.
Yeah.
But it's the winter, so I'm like,
Well,
this freaking thing.
even with
you know,
that
there's not a
story-
bridge, right? You're like, there should be a bridge over this. But in the summertime, when you're supposed to go through this area, you just, you know, take a nice dip in the cool mountain river, you know?
Yeah.
And I'm going through in the winter, and it's snow on both sides, and there's ice. I'm like,
Well, that's where it comes back to the
hell?
hurricane thing. Like, even the fact that there's this hurricane and
Yeah.
this unexpected river now that's like rushing that you have to ford.
yeah.
The fact that you survived makes it a better story.
The hurricane was warm, though.
But still,
The
fact
river
that,
I
like,
had
if
to
that
ford
hadn't existed, like, you
was
don't want
cold.
to cross that river in good weather. That wouldn't have been a good story. The fact that you like
It would've
have
been
that video
yeah,
and
yeah,
we're
yeah.
having to cross with like
Yeah.
worrying about like what's going to happen.
Yeah, the river freaked me out. I was like, man, this is going to suck.
There you go, type 2
And,
fun.
and you got to keep your shoes on, right? Because you want to keep a good footing, right?
Yeah.
And like literally there's snow on both sides. And I'm like up to my waist in this river. And it's a flowing river. Yeah, I forgot about that. Yeah. Oh, that was fun. Type 2.
Type 2 fun.
Sucked at the time,
there
though.
you go.
I feel like type 3 fun is just college. College can be described as type 3.
Yeah, it's fun
It's
during, and then you
drugs.
look back, it's like, what a waste of time.
The next one, you're going to have to stay with me a little bit on because it's from J Nunn. And Jay Nunn would like you to discuss this quote from Bill Bryan's A Walk in the Woods. I realized that I didn't have any feelings toward the Appalachian Trail that weren't contradictory. I was weary of the trail, but captivated by it. Found the endless slog increasingly exhausting, but ever invigorating. Grew tired of the boundless woods, but admired their boundlessness. Enjoyed the escape from civilization and ached for its comforts.
So in the thru hiking community, Bill Bryson is known as a puss, right? And I say that because he did not thru hike the trail. He's a writer, and he did hike some of the trail. But generally, amongst purists, he's a poser, right? That being said, he does bring notoriety to the trail, and he did have a great experience, and he experienced it in his own way, which is a legitimate experience, right? But he did not hike the whole thing, right? So every time I hear a quote from him, it is tainted with the fact that he didn't actually do it, right? He didn't actually hike the whole thing. He hiked very, very few sections of it to get enough info for his book, and then wrote a book, and he's an excellent author. And I've read the book. That's great, right? He's got that lovable person with him, you know, that's bumbling down the trail. His name's Katz or something like that.
Yeah.
That's you know, some sort of projection of you know, his inexperience on the trail. So in terms of what that quote means, you know, in terms of loving the trail, hating the trail, that kind of thing, I distinctly remember hating when the trail was jacked up. In other words, when the trail was hard.
Yeah.
When I couldn't find the trail, when there weren't markers. Anytime the trail wasn't a perfect pathway through the woods, I was mad for some reason. That's an interesting thing, right? Because, I mean, that's the hard part. That's the type 2 stuff. That's where you get the interesting stories. But anytime I wasn't flying down a perfectly manicured path in the woods, I was kind of angry at the trail.
But I bet right now, thinking back on it, you're probably thinking about it fondly in a weird way.
Well, I mean, because the stories, I don't remember, like, doing 4 miles an hour through the woods.
Yeah.
On like a nice cushy trail because, you know, it's
You
well
remember the
matted
hard
and
times.
yeah. I remember you know, but I remember being so pissed off in the moment, like, you know, that you know, what hillbilly made this trail? It went straight up, and now there's water coming down it.
Yeah.
Or then, you know, a little bit further on, this you know, New Jersey guy that built this trail straight up the hill. Now there's water coming down, and that water turned to ice, and I'm slipping down, hitting every rock on the way down, busting my ass because it's just an ice luge of rocks and branches that are stabbing me, you know, and you're just like falling, and you're like, what? Why is this so jacked up? And I'm so pissed off that this trail's jacked up.
Yeah.
Even though I did nothing to make the trail, I'm just a user, right?
Yeah.
And even though that's the interesting story. Or I come across this river and there's no bridge. So in terms of like the love-hate relationship, it's funny because the parts that you hate, you know, are the parts that you remember.
Well, it goes back to the type 2 fun thing. I think that's the story of adventure.
Yeah.
It reminds me of, I think it's a quote from like Apocalypse Now, where he's talking about, you know, he's in Vietnam, obviously. He's talking about like, when I'm out there, I wish I was home. When I'm home, I wish I was out there.
Yeah.
Well, it is kind of that dichotomy of the adventurous spirit where it's like, it's never enough. Like when you're at home, all you're thinking about is being back out in like the horrible conditions of wherever the adventure you had was. And when you're out there, all you can think about is like, I can't wait to go home and have like this meal, and I'm gonna drink, and I'm gonna like eat this food, I'm gonna sleep in this bed, and it's all gonna be great. It's the restless soul. It's just, you're never content ever.
So the other interesting thing that Bryson captured in that is that like tunnel of green, right? The monotony, we talked about the monotony a little bit, right? So because it's such a forested place, and I think in the video I mentioned, like, look at, I'm on top of this bald mountain, right?
Yeah, there's no wind at all.
Yeah, a lot of the times when you're on the Appalachian Trail, you're just in the middle of the forest. It's shaded. It's really nice because you're out of the heat, right? You don't have sun beating down on you. But if you're under tree canopy cover, that also means that you don't have a view.
Yeah.
So I also remember climbing to the top of these mountains, and you know, you're looking at this uphill, up for miles, right? You climb 5,000 feet. What do you expect to get when you get to the top of 5,000 feet?
You'd hope for a great view.
Yeah, most of the time it's not. That's the thing. Most of the time you get to the top of that 5,000 feet and it's just a bunch of trees up there.
Is it because below, it's still low enough altitude where a lot of trees can still grow.
The highest point on the Appalachian Trail is Klingman's Dome, which is 6,600 feet. And it's all forested.
Yeah, it's not that high.
Right? So, you spend a lot of time putting a lot of effort. That's McAfee Knob. Phenomenal view.
Yeah.
Phenomenal. That's the top of Mount Washington. Also a phenomenal view, right?
But you're saying these are few and far between.
These aren't the highest points on the trail, right? Like McAfee Knob just pops out. You're just there. You don't
Yeah.
have to work for it.
Yeah.
But you have to work to get up some of these hills. Like I think in that video I showed you, like I was like, look, I got to walk all the way down to that hut.
Yeah.
Just to go up that big mountain on the other side.
Yeah.
So the Appalachian Trail is up and down and up and down.
But your
And
view's not changing. It's still trees everywhere.
yeah, sometimes you will go up and down and it'll be really hard and you won't get a view out of it. And that's that, that's the monotony right there. And it's a lot of pain for nothing. And then other times, you'll get that. McAfee Knob, one of the unrivaled views in the world,
Yeah.
And a lot of those, like looking back on that video, like as I was clipping that together, like there are some unrivaled views that you're in the middle of nowhere. You look out, like I'm sure there's a city out there or whatever. Like at night, I could probably see the twinkling of some houses, but for the most part,
You're in the wilderness.
you're in the wilderness. You look out and it's wilderness,
Yeah.
as far as I can see, which is super, super amazing.
And do we have time for one more question?
Time for one more question. Final question of the night comes from Bob's two-car garage.
That's
Bob
Dad.
says, I hiked with him for 2 days. Did your dad slow you down?
Yeah, so
Is that, first off, that's literally your dad?
yeah, it's my dad. He's got a pretty successful YouTube channel, actually.
Interesting.
So he hiked with me for 2 days in the Smoky Mountain National Park, Great Smoky Mountain National Park, which is great. One day I saw 30 bears. It was nuts.
In one day,
In one day,
30 different bears.
30 distinct bears.
It's a lot of bears.
I mean, I count cubs, right? Like I saw 3 cubs and a
That
mom.
counts,
That's
yeah.
4, right? That's 4
And
bears.
These are all black bears, right?
Yeah, they're all black bears.
Okay.
Right? They all ran away. They have a very healthy bear population. So my dad met up with me in Great Smoky Mountain National Park. He did not slow me down. He hiked fast. I mean, he was pretty much in it to win it, right? And I don't know if I slowed. I mean, it's a nice place, right? We want to slow down, and I think my mom was in a car somewhere doing laundry for us. She was a great support, right?
Yeah.
Because you meet up and you give her a hug, and you're like, you smell.
Yeah.
So he hiked with me for a while. Didn't really slow me down. He's a pretty fast hiker. He's in shape, so it worked out pretty well.
Well, I think, and maybe this is a nice kind of last point to end on. You mentioned kind of meeting up with some friends, and now your dad. What was the balance between having this be like? Because I'm sure people knew what was going on in your life at that point in time, and there was an element of this that seemed like a journey that other people could participate in and be a part of, but then also something you had to do completely by yourself. What was the balance of that, and what did you come away from this whole experience kind of learning about the people around you, the people that are in your camp, yourself, and kind of how you've taken life from that point?
I think I learned that it's hard to dedicate so much time to an adventure, right? Most people have to have jobs, right? I was in a particular point in my life where I was afforded this opportunity,
Yeah.
and I think that's rare. To build a life around doing that all the time is difficult because, at the end of the end of the day, you have to make money.
Yeah.
And at the end of the day, I had to pay off that credit card debt I incurred. So you can't do that forever.
Yeah.
Right. So I was fortunate to meet up with friends and family along the way. They could come out for, a couple days, or a weekend. And I tried to make that happen as much as possible because I had a lot of friends along the East Coast that, wanted to be a part of it.
Sure.
My buddy came out and did the 4-state challenge with me at Harper's Ferry. My dad came out with me and hiked for a while.
Yeah.
I had some other friends up in the Northeast that visited me, and did little sections of the trail. So that was a lot of fun. And then I met people along the trail that were section hikers and came back and hiked with me later, right? Like they met, I met them on a hike and they're like, this is cool. And I'm like, yeah, it's fun, have fun back at your job.
Yeah.
And they're like, well, let me know when you're up in Pennsylvania. I'm like, okay, I'll give you a call when I'm in Pennsylvania. And, I'd email them and say, hey, I'm going to be in Pennsylvania in a week. You want to hike any of these sections? And they'd they'd link up with me and we'd hike for a while. So that was a lot of fun.
Yeah.
But it's hard to dedicate like such an amount of time to adventure.
Yeah.
I'm a professor now, right? So I think that's going to help quite a bit if I have some summers off. But I also have a kid, and I got to take care of that kid.
Yeah.
So when my son grows up at this point, where he can come out with a couple weeks, that's going to be the
There
next
you go.
big phase of adventure.
Well, especially living on the West Coast, you talk about the Pacific Coast Trail is one of the other great trails
yeah,
in the
Pacific
world.
Crest, yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, and it comes right through here, right? It's really close. So we could do that whole, we could do a fairly sizable chunk of the Pacific Crest Trail on weekends.
There you go. I mean, maybe, you do break it up. Maybe
Yeah.
it doesn't need to be as intense as your almost year-long.
It's more fun that way, though.
That's true. But, I mean, you can work within the constraints of,
Yeah.
what you have to work with. But
Any night outdoors is a good night.
that's a great point to end on.
Yeah.
So with that, Andy, I think we've completed our questions for the evening. Good to go. I'd like to say, again, Rich, thank you so much, for everything you do for the club as our first vice president, setting up these interviews week in, week out. It's a difficult challenge. Having sat in the chair now to interview you, I realize, firsthand the challenge of being here week in, week out, trying to connect with people from all kinds of diverse backgrounds, to bring out their stories, to talk about adventure as this abstract concept that we all, enjoy and chase after. But I appreciate you being here. I appreciate all the work you do. Andy, behind the scenes, I appreciate all the work you do. And to everybody tuning in tonight and watching in the future, I'd say continue to check out the Adventurers Club YouTube channel. Please subscribe, click the box for notifications, and continue to stay posted. Or we'll continue to bring you tales from off the beaten path at the world famous Adventurers Club Los Angeles.
Tales from the Adventurers Club Volume YouTube.
There you go. And next week we got a potentially spooky Halloween special episode.
Yeah, we'll see. I got to put something together.
We'll have to see how that
I got a
pans
good
out.
idea, though.
There you go. Thank you all for being here, and we'll see you next week.